welcome to Edge. If you're not in your seat, can you find a seat, and we'll make a start. My name is Andrew Betts. I'm from the Financial Times, which is a distinctively pink financial newspaper, and this is EdgeConf. We have Wi-Fi. That's the most important thing. So probably most of you have discovered it already. It's Google Guest. You don't need a password. And I have a few other announcements that I need to make before we make a start. So first of all, Edge is quite an experiment, and things may go wrong. In fact, about 7 things have gone wrong already. So I'm just going to give you a kind of a rundown of the thinking that went behind the design of the debate format and how we're kind of expecting the event to run. So each session is an hour long. We start with 10-minute opening talk. We have primary questions for the debate that we've pre-selected from Google Moderator, or which have been composed by the moderators of the sessions, and those have been seeded into the audience. So the people in the audience who are asking questions should know who they are. We have around 7 to 10 minutes of debate on each of those primary questions, and we're looking for interventions from everyone. So if you have a point to make, then jump in and make it, and make your voice heard. But it should be on topic. So each session, yes, don't just wax lyrical about anything. So if you have a point to make that's on the topic of the primary question, then jump into the debate and participate. Tips: if you think you have 7 points to make, choose the most important one, because we don't have time to hear all of them. And you don't need to introduce yourself, because we have this tool which Wesley Hales from Apogee has created, and which we're assured will be working perfectly today, which will enable everyone to request speaking time. So at the beginning of every session, you'll see a URL on the screen. Tap that into your smartphone, and you'll see a remote on your smartphone that allows you to request speaking time. So you can say, I want to speak in the debate. You'll come up on the screen. The moderator will be able to then call you to say what you want to say. 30 seconds is good. A minute is probably pushing it, so try and keep it short. And keep it on topic. This is the schedule for the day. So we're starting with responsive images. We've got rendering performance, third-party scripts, real-time data. We're breaking for lunch at 1:15, and lunch will be in this room, I believe. Offline legacy clients, and we finish up with payments. And after payments, we have dinner, which will be upstairs in the canteen, and then we go to the party. We have a hub page, edgeconf.com/hub. If you go to that on your phone, you'll get all the links to the session remotes, so you can get an easy link rather than having to see the URL at the beginning of every session. You can get the links directly from that page. There's also a link on that page to our feedback form. And it's really important for us, particularly as we're trying loads of new things today, that everyone gives us feedback. So do please fill that form in some point towards the end of the day. Here are the people who you need to thank for today. I'm the kind of curator of the event, so I chose all the speakers and invited them to be here. Pete LePage from Google, is he in the room, or is he having a heart attack somewhere? Yes, there he is. Tim Davenport, my colleague at FT Labs, who's back in London, has been sorting out the delegate logistics for us. Vivian Cromwell, who should be here somewhere. Is she here? Not here yet. She's been liaising with a lot of Google people for us. Jen Bouchard from Facebook, who's not here but is frantically organising our after party this evening. Wesley Hales from Apogee, who has put a phenomenal amount of work into creating the moderation tool that you'll be using today, and he is really keen to hear from anyone who has trouble using it. So where are you? Put your hand up. He's right over there. So if you can't make it work, then go and see him. Also, if you can't make it work, don't feel like you can't just put your hand up. Just get involved any way you can. And Dave Stanton from Pixelbots, who designed the EdgeConf website. So the organisations involved today: FT Labs, we curated the event. Google Chrome are providing this amazing venue and doing all the hosting for us. Facebook are organising our after party, and we also would like to thank Akamai and Adobe for sponsoring a couple of our sessions. So, important stuff. We have some fabulous prizes, mostly to encourage you all to submit feedback, but also for the most inspired intervention. So we want to hear people making really good points about new use cases, new problems, new solutions that they have, which maybe we don't know about. And it's that kind of thing we really want to hear and which we'll be giving prizes for. And we also gave everyone a raffle ticket when they came in, so there will be a random draw as well. And those fabulous prizes are Chromebook Pixels. Woo! So, woo! Woo! Steve, you're far better at this than I am. So you can look forward to that. And of course, part of the reason we're all here today is to support Girls Who Code, which is a fabulous charity based here in New York City that promotes women in technology and teaching girls to program. And I think that's an objective we can all get behind. So thank you very much for your contributions already and the contributions that you'll make today to that cause. So without further ado, our first session is responsive images. And the moderator of this session will be Marcos Caceres, is that right? Yes, Marcos Caceres from Mozilla. So Marcos, come up and make your introductions.
Great. Cool. I'm already on, and I didn't touch anything. So, come on up, folks, and I'll introduce you here. So, good seat. This is Yoav Weiss. I'll try to keep everything very brief as we get established. So, Yoav's been doing quite a lot of work with responsive images of late. He's heavily involved in the responsive images community group. Then we have Peter Miller. So Peter Miller is a developer, works on a lot of content-heavy websites, image-heavy websites, so great experience. Anne Robinson works for Yammer. Sorry, I forgot. Has written fantastic stuff about web performance, has some great ideas about how we can address some of the responsive images problems using progressive JPEGs. Estelle Whale. Has everyone heard of the clown car technique? The creator. So we're going to hopefully talk a little bit about that. And John Mellor works for Google. And John Mellor is probably the only person on earth who can tell you the difference between a device pixel, a real pixel, a CSS pixel, and all sorts of other pixels. So, and he can do it all in his head. It's pretty crazy. So, first up, we have Yoav, who's going to give a 10-minute talk, basically outlining what the current solutions are that we've been basically discussing for the last 2 years, trying to come up with a solution for responsive images. Take it away. So we'll swap seats.
So hi, as Marcus said, I'm Yoav Weiss. I'm here to talk about responsive images. I'll try to sum up 2 years of discussions into 10-minute talks, so bear with me. So first, in the mid-2000s, all we had was mobile-only sites. They were kind of lame with the slim content. Highly optimized images. It got a little better with the iPhone, but it wasn't that hot. Then responsive web design became a thing, and which was very cool. One code base to rule them all. You can serve all of the devices through a single site, but the problem is it was kind of slow. It became a synonym to slow mobile websites, which is a problem. So the reason is that most sites serve the same resources to both mobile and desktop. and most of that data is images. So there are a lot of savings to be made. What I wrote a utility which Tim Cadillac run. Tim Cadillac is a developer. Sorry for name dropping. But basically, we saw that up to 72% of the image data can be saved for some of the viewports in some of the cases. So there's a lot of savings to be made. And Retina only makes things worse because the gap between the smallest viewport, smallest images you want to send and the highest resolution images you want to send is getting bigger. And with most devs owning Retina devices, most devs are sending high-resolution devices to high-resolution images to all devices. So this is the responsive images problem, which we like to divide into two major use cases. The first one is resolution switching, serving different images to different devices, different dimension images, different devices. The images are the same images, same proportions, they're not cropped, but basically the quality is different. This is one example of that, and it can be further divided into DPR switching, serving Retina images only to Retina devices, and viewport switching, which is adapting the image dimensions to the actual display, to the size in which they will be displayed. Then the other major use case is art direction. Basically, it's content optimization without wasting too many bytes. It's matching the images to the layout in a way that makes sense. So either a crop or different proportions or something that works according to the actual responsive breakpoints. From a survey we ran, a lot of developers are already doing that using hacks, so this is a major use case. And so we've talked about the problem, let's talk about the solutions. There are several proposed standard solutions. There's the source set attribute, picture element, client hints, header, and I put a question mark in because it's not really a standard solution. This is just a proposal at the moment, but the responsive image container. I'll talk about each one in detail. So source set, basically it's the same old image tag, now with new attribute that can include multiple resources according to the DPR and the viewport. It's a slightly controversial statement, but it addresses mainly the resolution switching case and much less the art direction case. Some people would disagree, but the current implementation, SourceSet is currently implemented in WebKit and in Blink. It's behind a flag in Blink, and it's not yet shipped in WebKit, but it's there in the code base. Firefox will soon follow. And basically, it looks something like this. There's you specify the 1x or 2x or 1.5x or 3x qualifiers for each image resource you add to the page. The entire spec also includes viewport switching, which looks something like this. It's for each resource, you specify the max viewport for which it can be applied to, and the X factor that's adapted to it. The problem with that, it gives you a lot of expressive power, but you also have to, in some cases, like you can see in the example I put up, you have to define the URL, a single URL several times because it fits several DPR and viewport combinations. Then we have picture, which is mainly targeted at art direction. It specifies, it's an element with multiple source children. Each one of them is specifying an image resource based on media queries and possibly type. And the first matching resource is downloaded and displayed. It looks something like this. And as you can see, it can mix source set into the source elements. So you can define an R-directed image with multiple DPR versions of it. And the media attributes you use here are most probably the same media values that you use for your layout breakpoints, unlike viewport resolution switching, which can be independent of the layout viewport. Then we have, as a third contender or third proposal, we have client hints. That is, unlike the two others, it's not a markup-based solution, it's an HTTP-based solution. And basically, the client sends out its capabilities. It sends out hints to the server saying, this is my DPR, this is my viewport width or height, or the actual values are still debated, but this is the general spirit. And everything is done on the server side. It's server logic that serves one resource or the other. And one recent change to that proposal is that it's opt-in only. The hints are not sent on the first HTML request. On the other hand, it saves up us from adding data to requests where the server is not going to do anything about it. So that's a recent compromise that may be able to push the spec forward. Then I have something I'm proposing as more of a long-term solution. This is not something that's on anyone's immediate radar, but it's a long-term solution I'm proposing. That's a file format-based approach, where basically each target resolution that we want to serve is represented in a layer in some sort of a container. And these layers are building up one on top of the other so that the browser can download a certain number of layers and then add more layers on that, enhancing the quality of the image. It can address both resolution switching and art direction, and I'll just show you a bunch of examples. So basically for resolution switching, we have this photo that, if we look into the layers that compose it, it's a thumbnail, then an enhancement layer, which is basically the thumbnail upscaled with a diff from the original image downscaled. So an enhancement layer, and another one that's basically used to recreate the original image without adding many bytes to the process. The overhead is very small. And for our direction, the same can be applied. So this bigger image that's used everywhere for our direction can be split into a crop, then an enhancement layer, and another one. The advantages are that markup is not touched. You have a single file per image, so it's easy to maintain. And the best one for me is that the browser can just download diffs. If they had downloaded one image and then something in the browser's environment have changed, you can download the diff. The disadvantages are that it's complicated to implement, and basically the coding performance and network performance without HTTP2 is currently a mystery. We need to further investigate that in order to know if it's feasible or not without HTTP2 and in terms of the coding performance. And last minute slides added by John Meller here. Maybe you want to talk about that?
So a possible way of making this responsive image format container load more efficiently, when you're making sort of several range requests or something, and you don't want to leave gaps between, wait for a round trip each time. We'd load all the images on the page in parallel, progressively. So I've taken an Ultra website, I've stolen this, sorry. On the left, you see the images being loaded one by one sequentially. On the right, you see the images being loaded all in parallel. It's the same progressive JPEGs on both sides, just that on the left, I'm truncating the stream of images so that you get the first image and then I truncate at some point there. On the right, I truncate all the images at the same percentage. So this is 5% of the image bytes. And you can see that on both sides, the page doesn't look great. But by the time you've got to 10% of the image bytes, already on the right, you can kind of see what the page looks like. All the images are really blurry and so on, but they at least sort of fill their space well. Whereas on the left, you can see sort of the top left, you can see the start of the top left image, but all the other images haven't even started loading yet. As you gradually load more, say you're on...
Increments of 10.
Say you get to 25%, for example. Now the page on the right, we've only loaded a quarter of the image bytes, but it already starts to look okay. The images aren't crisp, but they're still perfectly usable. Whereas on the left, we have this super crisp, lovely image in the top left, but the other images haven't even started loading. By the time you get to sort of 50%, the page on the right now looks perfect. You can almost not tell that it hasn't finished loading the images. Whereas on the left, again, we've only got half the images. And then as you load more bytes, the page on the right gradually becomes like a super crisp Retina beautiful page, but it's a very subtle difference between that and the 1x image. Whereas on the left, only now at 100% do we actually have all the images at all visible.
Yeah, great.
This is great. I love that you're giving something, to the users like while they're waiting. That's brilliant. That's what I love about progressive JPEGs is that it will download the first scan as soon as possible.
So I think that's kind of a good lead into the first question that we have, which is from Jake Archibald. Hope I pronounced that right. Jake, do you have your question with you? Yes, mic runner, please. There goes Pete. He's going to be really slim by the end of the day.
Hey, okay, so I currently send like a 2 times or 2.5 times image and just compress the hell out of it. And the file size is kind of roughly the same as a 1x image. And that seems to do the job. Why do we need all these extra markup examples? And if in the future John's solution can come in and stop the download at some point, I mean, surely that's all we need.
So, good way to start, John.
So should we start with the difference between fixed width and flexible width images? So this ties into what Yav was saying earlier about resolution switching. There's 2 kinds. There's DPL switching, where your image is a fixed size, like a logo or an icon. It's going to be the same width, say 32 pixels on all devices. And all you need to do is switch it out based on the device's pick screen density. So you might need a 2x image on a Retina screen, a 3x image on like Samsung Galaxy S4, that kind of thing. But all you're doing is changing it based on the device pixel ratio. With a flexible width image, say you've got width 100%, then suddenly the width for the viewport of the device matters. And so your phones, your tablets, your laptops, they all have different widths, they all need different images. And here, a simple technique which gets you up to double the resolution of an image by compressing it more heavily isn't going to scale to sort of an 8 times bigger image.
Cool. So, what do you think?
One more thing regarding the compressive images hack.
Explain what the hell compressive images.
What Jake was talking about. Basically, taking the high-res images and compressing them, extremely compressing them, so that they will be, when downsized to a 1x display dimensions, they will still look good. And also for Retina, they look quite fine because the actual display dimensions are.
Hang on, so I'm seeing a few kind of people looking at you going. So let's see if we can explain that a little better. Does anyone have a go at explaining a little better?
I mean, I can try. So somebody discovered that if they keep the resolution really high in an image, but they put the compression down to, I think, 0. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So they'll actually get a smaller file size that is higher resolution, and it looks good on Retina images, and you have a smaller file size for speed. So it's actually best of both worlds, and it's kind of like an amazing discovery.
Yeah. So we're just gonna I'm sure if we go back to 1996, we might find the same thing. But who knows? Because we were doing it for modems and stuff anyway. So I guess what I'm wondering is, what might be some of the side effects? Because we're sending 4 times the data, right? Basically they're sending images 2 times or even more, bigger than this size. It might be 3 times.
Yeah.
So can the browser really handle that? Do we know if there's side effects within the browser? Maybe John's in a good position because he's closer to Chrome.
We don't really have to research yet. So yeah, it's going to take 4 times the memory. On an image-heavy page, that might blow your memory budget, and suddenly things like painting and scrolling might get slower. It's hard to know. We need more research, basically.
Right. Yeah, we need to experiment with that, but it's a super interesting idea.
Yeah, basically, it's on the agenda to get some real hard data on the implications of that. But
on the agenda of who?
On the responsive images community group's agenda, to get some hard data on that for the DPR switching case. But exactly as John said, it doesn't cover all the cases, and it can cause decoding performance and memory issues. So if you're using that, you need to test it well to make sure there are no problems, because we don't have general data.
So I'm going to bounce a question to Peter Miller, because he's kind of he's working on a lot of, you're working on some fashion websites, and you've done anyway, for whichever ones, obviously you'd have access to the very high resolution pictures that are coming straight from photographers. What would this mean for maybe you guys? Would it mean anything?
Well, I think that, first of all, I think I've looked at the solution, and I've got a Retina MacBook, and I think it's still a matter of subjective opinion, maybe, about whether this does look as good as real Retina images or 2x images. But I think possibly thinking about it even today is the bigger problem that, okay, well, we can send these kind of pseudo 2x images down to be shrunk down at 50%. But what happens when we maybe want to expand those images or have them be more of a percentage width? And then suddenly we're actually showing those highly compressed 2x images at their 1x size, at their physical 1x size, and then maybe they look even worse.
Okay.
I think whenever we have this debate, we also still have to remember the people who have metered bandwidth, because yeah, on your MacBook Pro, on your Wi-Fi, it's going to be great, but someone doesn't want to download that when they're paying $19 for.
So yeah, absolutely. So, but let's hold on that one, because that one takes us off to the following question. Okay. So I want to not go into those exact concerns, because what Anne originally said was you can make a larger image that's actually smaller in kilobytes than. So in a sense it doesn't really apply, but it does. But we're getting to exactly to the point.
We also have to think about Android 2.4 and older Androids, which are still being sold today, because they don't have the memory capacity. Right.
Even Firefox OS is 250 megabytes of RAM on that, and it's it struggles. So absolutely. So anyone want to? I think we should probably move on to the next topic. So the second question. Is there a George Crawford?
Hi, this is one of the anonymous questions from Google moderator. Is DPI negotiation only a stopgap? Bandwidth keeps growing exponentially, LCD prices are dropping, GPUs benefit from Moore's law. In several years, will it make sense to just send high-resolution images to all users?
So, I mean, the implications are, this goes back, if we look at all the computing history, right? Will 64K be enough? And more slow, the computers just get faster, and yet we kind of seem to find ourselves in the same situation over and over again. Like back in 1996, like I was saying before, it's like we had modems and we had to compress the crap out of images then as well to cater to users that were just getting cable and who didn't have cable and still were on 54K and 54 baud rate modems, blah, blah. So thoughts, should we really worry that much? Should we stop caring? I know everybody's probably excited, so let's do a round, but and bounce back if we can, but let's keep it short.
Okay, I mean, I think that it would be nice if we could just send super large images, but I don't think we can do that quite yet. And I think that the responsive images, it's such a topic because we're getting smaller and slower, and we're getting bigger and faster at the same time, right? So this is spreading out. So yeah, I have obviously my opinions, but I think that we need a responsive images container. Could be possibly a progressive JPEG that has like really small scans and really large scans, and possibly the browser only downloads what it needs.
So we have a delegate in the queue. I'll just get Mike Petrovich ready. Well, if you can jump to a mic. So, Pete, do you want to quickly jump in on this?
Well, I think staying in a hotel room in New York City, it actually feels like we're quite a few years away from being very fastly connected across everywhere.
Yeah.
But also, you've got to think data plans, roaming. You want to give the users maybe an option to have a low resolution mode, but if we're just always sending that high resolution. But also allowing for the art direction case, I don't think that this caters for that.
I think that, as Anne started to say, I think that Moore's law is not giving us expanded bandwidth. I mean, we get a larger range of devices. We have capable smaller devices, and the bandwidth coverage is not ubiquitous. So basically, it's a question that asks us whether we can look into the future. And unfortunately, we can't. But I don't think it may. In 20 years, it may be irrelevant.
Well, we can. We can't look into the future, but we can see what the trends are, right? We know like that we have now like Google Glass and Samsung's watch and things like that. So
exactly,
in a sense, we know a little bit where machines are going. And again, we're going to see the same cycle. So
yeah, and
so basically, the problem is getting worse.
Yeah.
So we found Mike.
Yeah.
Do you
hear me?
Yep. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah. Just a quick question about. So I'm. One of you mentioned, what if you have a small image? I mean, using high compression at a large size that was initially seen small, but then expanded. It seems to be a consequence of the actual the JPEG format. What about new formats such as WebP that, and using things like that?
So maybe I'll get John to respond to that one.
So I'm not an expert on WebP, but yeah, it tends to give. It seems to have two things that are nice. It gives slightly better performance and compression performance, ranging from like 25 to 60, or it depends what you're doing with it. But it's also, when very highly compressed, you get less of the sort of blocking artifact you get with JPEG. So you can actually afford a greater compression ratio than you would use with JPEG. So that can help, but there are issues of browser support and so on, of course.
Also with WebP, perceived performance is like slower than progressive JPEG, right? Because you're actually getting a scan earlier than a WebP. Even if a WebP is a smaller file size, progressive JPEG is going to beat it every time.
Am I right to? Somebody can correct me here, but it doesn't support progressive loading. Or does it?
That's a good question.
No, there's no current support for progressive loading.
So I think that's at least from Mozilla's perspective, following the bug about WebP, that's a real showstopper for us.
Correct.
Yeah. So.
I'm not sure a future progressive WebP can answer that, or a progressive JPEG, but basically I think that it's not a question of image format, because we have progressive image formats, or we can easily come up with like the responsive image container stuff, we can easily, it's a prototype, but it's not something, it's not complicated to get this done. The problem is that currently there are no fetching mechanism in place that can download only the start of the image for low resolution devices and download the entire image for high resolution devices that have the bandwidth and have the capability to decode it. And I think that getting the fetching mechanism in place would be an enabler for such optimization, for such formats to
So
be useful.
I want to quickly get Still's thoughts on all this.
So I was, going back to the original question, I think we're never going to be able to just have one image solution, which is why because you don't want to have the same image if your device is this big versus if your image is this big. For those listening to audio, you don't want to have the same image if you have a 20-inch image versus a half-inch image.
But we actually could do that, right? Because with a progressive JPEG, you can have a variable number of scans, and the scans are of increasing quality. So you could have, say, 40. Like, let's expand our minds about this. Like, is that correct? Like, we could. Okay, don't.
If you're getting into 40 times bigger zone, you will get color distortion.
Well, no, I mean, I'm talking about the art direction. If you're going to...
Oh, so
yeah.
Putting the art direction topic aside for a second, you actually can have like a progressive JPEG that has a very small scan and then, the very high resolution. So you can have a tiny image that downloads very quickly, and you can have a super large HD image for...
Yeah, but I think we can't put the art direction aside because we are serving so many different devices. So I think the answer to the question is, I don't think serving one image will be the solution in the end because we are reaching such a plethora of sizes.
We're going to kind of continue to... The next question is very much related to this, so I'm going to... Before I do that, I'm going to queue up Kyle. Kyle, do you have a mic already? Where's Kyle? Sorry, Kyle Simpson.
He's over there.
So I'm going to queue up Kyle. He's right there. So, Kyle, just a quick question or comment.
So a lot of these solutions seem to be sort of art direction centric, like I want the best possible images that can be there. But responsive seems to respond to maybe the screen size, maybe to the bandwidth, but it doesn't seem to react to the environment. Say, if I start out loading a Flickr page that the battery power is at 50%, I've got plenty of processing power, but if I'm now at 2%, maybe the device should start choosing not to render these higher things. So can't we have solutions that allow apps to respond to more complex situations than just the screen size?
So a quick, we're going to cover that as well, but somebody wants to make a quick comment?
Just a quick comment. That's something that certainly should be possible with when we're talking about resolution switching, when we're talking about things that won't break the layout, but just would give the user a lower quality image when it can't download the high-res quality image. And this is something that should be heuristically possible with SourceSet. So the browser in SourceSet, basically, the spec contains an asterisk saying eventually the browser can do whatever the hell it wants. So so the browser can decide based on user preference, based on environment, based on battery, to not download the high-res images, but the low-res ones.
So it's kind of a good thing and a bad thing, but it does mean it's a declarative model. You're handing over control. You're saying to the browser, this is what I got, deal with it, do it best for the user.
Yeah, I don't think this should be something decided by the web developer, because I don't think they have this kind of information. We cannot have this kind of information available to the web developer. This is something that should be done by the browser with the user preference.
Right, so I'm going to be moderator here. Jump over to the next question because they're all related anyway. So we're going to basically this to the points. Calvin Spielman. Your question. So, runner?
Yeah, I was basically wondering about if we are fighting a losing battle by continually generating all these different image sizes and different resolutions up front, when there's constantly new devices, constantly different sizes. We're always going to be constantly trying to catch up and generating more and more images, as opposed to having some server-side solution that does it dynamically and optimizes the set of images we have.
So I think this ties in kind of beautifully to the stuff that John was presenting before, and also to the progressive JPEG, well, to having those multiple scans. So, John, with the kind of work that you've been doing, you know, what are you seeing? What are the numbers basically telling you there?
So I guess there's two aspects of this question. On the server side, sure, you don't want the artist to be manually saving out like 20 different versions of every image. It's not scalable. So I guess on the server side, you kind of have to be at the moment dynamically creating these images by automatically resizing them. But then I guess I'm like this as well. It would be nice if there was only one image you have to save. Like you just told your Photoshop or whatever, save out one ultra high resolution image, and the browser downloads just the beginning of it, like however much it needs.
Yeah, that's perfect. I think that's the most elegant solution. I think that the second most elegant solution is like with client hints, and having the server like serve up different resolutions, different versions of the image. But it has to be automatic. Like we should not be creating, you know, X number of images, you know, to serve to different devices, and we are losing. You know, we are like fighting a losing battle in that case.
I think the
quick audience. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, but if you have that situation, aren't you going to end up in the thing that all the developers were complaining about when the operators started to compress your images on mobile networks, and they sort of say, "Just get out of my way! I don't want you to touch my stuff." If you've got some automated system that sits between the thing, you're creating the same problem that 3 years ago you're all whinging about.
My thought was that this would be, I think it should be server side, so that the developer is actually deciding what you're sending over. Not the browser should not be altering images, is my thought.
But the developer doesn't know the bandwidth of the client.
No, I mean with client. When we're all said and done, when we have client hints and everything else, it should be the server that's making the 20 images and serving the correct image based on the client hints or the source set, not the browser that's taking an image and deciding that the upper left-hand corner should be shown instead of the middle of it.
It seems a lot easier for the browser to take the user's preference into account, though. Like if the user decides that they're roaming or something and they only want the very low resolution image, then do you want like an extra client hint saying I'm roaming, an extra client hint saying these kind of things?
No, the browser can say, you can change, like when you have client hints, I guess should we ask the question about client hints that we're going to ask later?
No, because I think we are talking about, like, I don't think we need to move to that question yet,
okay.
Because we are kind of dealing with or discussing a very serious problem, which is, you know, how can computers really decide this? How do we set the breakpoints, or not even the breakpoints, but you know, this looks good here, so send this, and so on. So having that level of control, which was, so as Steve was saying before, it's like that was pissing people off, developers, because it didn't look good. And to some degree, you know, well, that's what we really need to look at. Can we computationally do that? And John's research seems to suggest that it can, because you do get at least the user gets the initial layout with the nice images or beginnings of a nice image, and then from there you start progressively improving it. So how much do you need to push it, and what does that mean on the server? It's kind of hard to know.
My opinion on this is that basically you need all solutions to be automizable, so you can do either dynamic or a build step or something on the server side that does all the grunt work for you as a developer. But I don't think, at least, we must have some solutions that don't require it. So
I got two questions from the floor. I got one from, sorry, your name? Oh, sorry, okay. I thought you, okay, yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I thought you were going to ask a question. No problem, go ahead.
So if we start generating 20, 30 different versions of files on the server side and start doing very client headers or whatever, are we going to have problems where the edge caches just can't keep all of these? I mean, we're going to be blowing out 20 different times the number of files on all the edge caches. Are CDNs going to be useful anymore at that point? How's it going to scale?
I think since the very woodwork, since the client hints is 1 hint per header, so very woodwork. But I think the edge caches will have to adapt to the new reality of much more images than before. But since I don't think this will be it may be exponential, but there will be time to adapt. I mean, as far as the edge caches go. So that's my opinion.
Hang on, don't speak without the mic. So I was gonna jump to, so I'll go to Matt. I think you had a question. No, you're good. Okay, cool. So Peter, you're looking like you want to say something.
Well, I mean, when the original question was first asked, the case that comes to my mind is still the art direction case, because it is very important for publications that I work on. The crop has to be right, and that's why we do upfront generation. We have picture editors, and they are in charge of saying, when this image is displayed at this size, then here's a crop I want. But I've worked with content management systems in the past that will define that given coordinates. So yes, we can automatically resize images dynamically, but maybe we could allow picture editors to dynamically come in and draw some coordinates for different use cases and different contexts. And about the question about whether it's the browser that decides it or it's the developer that decides it, absolutely, I think it has to be the browser that decides it. It's not just the resolution of the screen. It's not just the size of the screen. It's not just the battery power. It's actually everything else to do with what's rendering that image element, and it's not just the HTML, it's a style sheet as well.
So this leads beautifully to the next question, which is by Jeffrey Selman. Is he here? Yeah. There he is.
Thank you. So this is an annoying theoretical purity question supplied by the moderator. And I have a complicated relationship to it because since 1998, I've been beating the drum for separation of presentation and structure, but I'm also a big supporter of Matt Marcus and picture. Hey, buddy. Is it problematic that we describe the presentation of images in markup against our typical mantra to separate presentation from content? And, if so, does the specification of a myriad of sizes make this worse?
So we saw this. Hopefully you had the same kind of gut reaction when you saw both source set and picture and when you saw the code up on the screen and you kind of went, ugh, really? We have to type all those ×1 and ×2, and you saw picture like bloats like all over the place, and it has media queries in it as well. So this goes straight to I know Jeffrey didn't ask the question specifically, but like he said, it's bad because we are putting media queries into our markup. What can we do there? Is there possible solutions?
So the reason that there's a difference between images and background images is because the image tag IMG is a foreground image, it's content, versus all the design that we have on the web page.
Right.
So yes, we do have to keep it. The image is actually content.
Right. But what about the media query component?
The media query should be, that's why we're trying to come up with all these different solutions, and why the picture element and the source set looks so ugly, and actually why I like the clown car technique, because it actually separates out the content.
Do you want to, so just for people who don't know the clown car technique, just like a super Twitter size.
Okay, 3 tweets. It's basically, instead of using pulling in an image, it pulls in an SVG, and inside the SVG, that's where all the media queries are. So it pulls in the correct image based on the container of the SVG. And it works fairly well. It's basically a stopgap solution while we're trying to figure out the correct solution. But the reason that I liked the clown car technique is because it actually separated out content from presentation, from behavior, from images.
I think it absolutely is a problem that we're defining the media queries in the HTML. I don't think it's a problem of bloat, that's fine. I think we can give the HTML all the sources of the images, as I was saying before, but I think the problem is illustrated in the case where, let's say on a 500 pixel wide screen, virtual pixels, you have an image at 100% width. On a 700 pixel screen, you might actually have that image at 50% width because you've got a second column come in. And okay, fine, when I'm writing the HTML, maybe I'll take that into mind. But what if it's not an HTML generation problem? What if it's a render problem where when a user's logged in, then you have a sidebar, but when they're not, you don't. And in CSS, I can have the column at 50% or 100% if it's got a sibling with the logged in sidebar. But I'm going to want a different image source to apply to that element. And that's why a technique that takes into account the actual width of the image element rather than the width of the screen, I think is absolutely essential. And that's why I do still have a problem with the picture element.
So I think you will come in and
yeah.
So this is alluding to, some people might have heard about element queries.
Yeah.
Which are kind of like CSS applied to a particular container element, and it's pretty cool. It has its problems.
Yeah.
It has its problems.
So actually, there are several questions here. First, for the separation of content and presentation, I think it's a problem. I think that this is something that can be resolved by drawing out the media queries out of HTML and into some sort of a media query variable.
So drawing out being?
Don't repeat yourself. Just basically creating variables that say mobile or whatever that means, or basically create named media queries and use them instead of the actual media queries wherever you have media queries in your markup, so be it picture or external style sheets.
Yep.
And or in the CSS as well. Yep. There is work in the CSS working group regarding that. I have no idea when it will go in, but people are working on it. And so regarding that, I think that will resolve most of the issues from this separation of concerns point of view. Regarding
hang on. So the questions I have is like, okay, so with picture is probably the main offender here. Should we even bother continuing to work on it in that sense?
I don't think picture is the most visible offender, but again, there are style sheets. There will, if I'll have my way, media attributes will be everywhere, which I probably won't have my way, but I think that there are a lot of resources that can be downloaded based on media, and I think we need to have some shortcut for media queries that we don't have to repeat them everywhere, including in CSS, because in CSS we repeat them as well.
It's true.
And regarding the element queries stuff, first of all, I'd like to say that the main advantage of the clown car technique versus basically anything else is that it basically emulates element queries. The media queries there refer to the viewport of the SVG, not the viewport of the document. So while it creates some delay in download, it's sometimes necessary to, there are cases where it's useful, extremely useful. But the problem with element queries is that you cannot start downloading the resource before you have layout, which means you add a significant delay to the entire page load.
So, Anne, do you have any comments about?
Yeah, I'm still a fan of progressive JPEGs, and I think that no, I think that there's definitely the art direction case. It doesn't really handle, obviously, but I don't think that we should forget about it as a file format that we might explore. And we often do forget about progressive JPEGs. I think we forgot about progressive JPEGs for like 10 years. We just.
So what is the reason we forgot about them? So what browser doesn't really support them well?
Oh. I mean, I think that in general, there's pretty good browser support. I think that the reason browsers don't support them is because we stopped using them, and I think we stopped using them because things changed. We had faster connections, but then things kind of reverted with mobile, and we went back to where we were, where speed turned out to be an issue again. So yeah.
Cool.
That's it.
So there's one question from the audience. Go ahead.
Sound like the best solution for the picture element is to move the rules to CSS. You can go back to regular IMG and have something that says in CSS like, for all images which have a path that looks like this, then apply these rules to add .2x to the path. This allows you to move the more presentational parts of it to the CSS while still keeping the content, namely the fallback image, in the HTML. And if you can do something like a regex to not have to write this 2x, that 2x, something else 2x for 2x versions of every single image you have.
So
and you can sort of do this right now using attribute selectors and the IMG tag.
Using what selectors?
You can sort of do this now using attribute selectors.
Attribute selectors.
Yeah, but once per SRC, which will be annoying.
Right. So yeah, so it's kind of like a mix of things. So I'm sure one of these other guys will be able to talk about the concerns there. I can give a little bit. It's like some of the main problems that we're trying to solve with responsive images as a whole is integrating nicely into how browsers load images and performance-wise. So to block and wait for a star sheet to download that will give you the instructions to then be able to fetch the files that you need will probably cause issues. Part of the stuff that Yoav was talking about before about these CSS-based variables that you can put in is that you would need to insert them at the top of the document inline, so then they would actually parse before anything else. So there's like big performance issues with all this. So like, it's a cool solution, but like and I'm not saying that it wouldn't work, but it's like working out how all the dynamics work there within the browser. It's pretty crazy. Does anyone want to add? Probably ones who add.
I just want to add that it's basically violating the separation of concerns from the other side of the spectrum. You're putting basically your content is now part of your presentation in a way, because the content URLs rely on the CSS. So you would have to either, I mean, for CSS caching, content images tend to change often. Everything that's in CSS usually changes, less often than that, so it can be cached for a long while. So it violates the layers as far as I'm concerned, in a way.
So let's take that one up. So I got another question from the audience and another one from. So I got a couple here. I'm gonna go there first, and then we'll bounce to. Sorry, you already have the mic, so go ahead, and then I'll bounce to you. Sorry.
Just to counteract that, how you say if you need to download the CSS first in order to display the image, but if the CSS modifies the size of the image, which can modify the art direction and the actual one that you want to use, isn't that important?
It is, but like I said, like it's all like a traits and balance kind of thing, because you really, we are trying to keep the performance high, so there is going to be a penalty for everything. So where you defer, like you were saying, the separations of concern, it's going to have issues with how the images are loaded and when. So if the things have to be deferred, then you might defer layout, and that's going to impact the user's perception of whatever application you're trying to run. So again, we need to test a lot of this stuff. We don't know. It's still like, even though we've been talking about it, now it's like really time to start testing some of it. So
I guess I just had more of a direct question for Peter. Sorry to put you on the spot, but given the kind of art direction perspective, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, from your standpoint, what is best practice right now, given that it's not all just programmers trying to do stuff in an automated fashion, because every time I've tried to do that, I fail, and the art director looks at me and is like, no, we need to crop it this way instead. So
I want you to answer that, but I think this is a great question, because it's really about, what should developers be doing today? And I think, like, John has some ideas. Anne's already talked about, let's try out this progressive JPEGs, and Yav and I kind of been working on the standards, trying to, look forward. Stel's been kind of experimenting with the clown counter technique. So by all means, so we have 5 minutes. So like 1 minute each. What can developers do today, starting with Peter?
Okay, well, here's what we're doing. We're sending lots of the JPEG sources into the HTML as a JSON string on a data attribute. We've got JavaScript running that will, after the CSS has evaluated the layout, will pick the right source and apply it, and on resize change it. Yeah, the performance isn't great for that. But to answer a little of what Yoav was saying, that I think that having a default source there, low res, your best guess is, I think, an okay way to go for what we have now.
Okay, and what do you recommend for developers?
I mean, I think that what we have now is a bunch of hacks, right? So that's what we have. I think that we should try and focus. I love that we're doing this, and I think what we're talking about are like big wins and solutions for responsive images. I think we should really be forward thinking and not forget all of the different options and all of our different paths and explore them all.
I think it's great.
I think that all current hacks have performance trade-offs. All current hacks, basically, you're deferring the loading of the image to a later time in order to download the appropriate one. I think that things will look up soon. Things will get better soon. There's currently work in the responsive images community group on an X picture polyfill that will use
web components.
Yeah, that uses web components in order to emulate picture. It won't work with the preloader, but assuming if you don't have any blocking scripts at the page's top, it should have similar performance characteristics as image. So current hacks all have problems. Future hacks will get better. And hopefully, and then there's a source set. Hopefully, it will ship
soon enough
in a default browser. I mean, in a release build soon enough.
Okay.
So I guess the question is what developers should be doing now, and what developers should be doing now is being concerned about what they're sending over the wires and making sure that they're not sending huge assets to limited bandwidth devices. And in terms of what we should be doing, or the spec authors should be doing, is we should also, I think, what I haven't heard, and I just thought of while I was on stage, so I don't know, maybe it has been, there's some CSS, there's the image element you can clip and pick certain areas, so maybe figuring out a way to do that on the back end or through client hits so that you're actually just downloading based on that instead of downloading the whole image.
Right, so just expanding on that one. So it's basically just taking, you have your normal image, and then you select the area that you want to crop out, and basically you just crop it out with CSS. It's a good way of doing art direction, and it fits quite well with compressive images as well.
So we'll give several answers. For CSS, you can just use media queries to switch out the right image. It's in a better state these days. For HTML, there's 3 different things. For fixed size images, we're just switching based on the device pixel ratio. Compressive images, like serving a double size but highly compressed image, is reasonable. Source set will be nice, but only once browsers support it. For viewport-based switching, where you need to take into account flexible images, I think the best solution these days is to load a very low-quality placeholder, which you embed directly in your, which is directly referenced from your HTML, and then later on, using JavaScript, you swap it out with an appropriate resolution image based on the actual image size or whatever.
Would you use the classic, I don't even know if this works here, but like there was like a low source, low SRC attribute on HTML?
I mean, I just use SRC, so put the low quality one in SRC and use JavaScript to replace that with a better quality one once you've loaded that in the background. So you get kind of like this progressive thing, right? The page loads in low quality quickly and gradually becomes higher quality. So I actually released a library for this yesterday. It's on github.com/johnmeller/respswap.js. Very early stages. Finally, for art direction, where you actually need a different image rather than just a different resolution of the same image, you can't load a low-quality placeholder because you don't know what image it's going to be. And so for that, you can use something like picture fill or whatever. But don't use picture fill for viewport switching.
So picture fill, just for people who don't know what that is, so picture fill is you can Google it, you'll find it pretty quick, and it's basically the similar syntax to the picture element, but done with divs and I think divs and spans or something. But it basically works.
But the downside is that the images don't load until the page is fully finished loading and you've reached DOM content loaded, and so your images will start loading much later than if you've got like a placeholder or something.
Yeah. And just to emphasize on that, picture fill should be used for art direction and not for for resolution switching.
I'd like to add one comment, because the picture fill, the reason that it's an issue is because it's on DOM content loaded. We should make on DOM content loaded much faster. It shouldn't be taking 10 seconds to download your page. And that's one thing we should definitely be working on as developers.
I think we'll hopefully cover it in one of the other sessions, because that's part of the performance thing. So there is work around that we would basically say, and I'm just wrapping up here for the session, but basically you would just say, my page is ready now. So you, as an author, you say, forget DOM content loaded, but page is done. And you send like a fake DOM content loaded event that indicates to the browser, now I'm ready to do other stuff. So please join me in thanking the panel here. So, sorry?
Thanks, guys. So sorry about the technical problems in the first session. We have a web server that we evidently need to reboot somewhere. So while we do that, let's crack on with the second session. So we have Andre Behrens from the New York Times, who will be leading our rendering performance session. We'll start off just as we are. So if you have a question, just raise your hand. And as soon as we can get the moderation tool working, we'll be switching to that. But thanks for your patience, and help me welcome Andre Behrens.
Everyone could just come up. Hey, Paul. Hey, how you doing? Okay, so we're going to be talking about rendering performance, or as I like to think of it, the war on purple and green. I'm sure you've engaged that yourselves from time to time. On our panel today, we have Josh Peak from GitHub, Arya Hedayat from Sencha. We have our opening speaker, Jonathan Klein from Etsy. We have Paul Liss from Google, and we have Eli Fiddler from BlackBerry. So let's just go in with the presentation. You ready to go? We get the presentation up.
Okay. When we talk about rendering performance, we're really talking about this number here. Most monitors and devices we have today are rendering.
Mike.
Hey, that's a lot better, thanks. Most monitors and devices we have today are rendering at about 60 frames per second. So when we talk about rendering performance, we're really talking about trying to get your application to render at 60 frames per second with all animations, with scrolling, etc. If you do the math on this, it means that we have 16.6 milliseconds approximately to get a paint event done. So anytime you have a paint event that's taking longer than that to render on your page, you're going to get jank on the page, and it's going to be slow. Luckily, we have tools today that make this pretty easy to see what's going on. This is an example of Chrome DevTools. All you do is turn on the continuous page repainting mode, and then in the upper right section of the page, you'll get a nice meter that tells you exactly how long the paints are taking. This is on the Conf website. You can see here 2.7 milliseconds for this paint event, and then there's a meter on the right there that says it's ranging between 2.6 and 4.6. This is very, very fast paints. If our budget is 16.6 milliseconds, then 2.7 is well within that budget. And as you scroll the page, this meter will adjust depending on how long the paints are taking. So anytime you see this meter spike above 16.6 milliseconds, you're going to get that jank that I talked about. And jank is something that I'm sure we've all seen. It's basically when you're scrolling a page and it hangs, or an animation is happening and you can't scroll. Anytime where the page performance drops below 60 frames per second. And again, this happens pretty widely on the web today. and it's a pretty big problem. And that's the term that's been generated for it. What causes jank, now that we know what it is? Well, this slide I pulled directly from the Jankbusters Google I/O talk earlier this year. And I think it gives a good overview of the main things that are important to think about. These things really fall into two categories. So first is unnecessary paints. So this is if you have, maybe your paints are fast, but you have too many of them. So you try to jam hundreds of paints into a single scroll event, and that's just not going to perform well, no matter what you're doing. And the other category is long paints. So these are examples where you might have a single paint event, but it takes more than your budget of 16 milliseconds to render. And there are some examples here of different event handlers that can cause that problem, CSS issues, and just visually complex pages. Why do we care about jank? Why do we care about rendering performance in general? People have talked a lot historically about page performance itself, but this idea of rendering performance is fairly new. During Edge London earlier this year, we heard Shane O'Sullivan say that Facebook artificially lowered the frame rate on their iOS and Android apps from 60 frames per second down to 30 frames per second, and engagement collapsed, according to him. On a native app, it's pretty easy to get 60 frames per second. If you get down to 30, that's pretty bad. So they artificially did this to, he said, a small segment of their users, maybe a few dozen million users, and it caused major problems. At Etsy, we did a similar test in the sense that we started prefetching JavaScript on our search results page. When the JavaScript came down the pipe and was actually executed by the browser, we got janky behaviors. So essentially, you'd see in the Chrome console that the JavaScript came in, and then the page performance would degrade. You couldn't scroll the page, and it was really nasty. We were monitoring all the business metrics on this page when we were testing this change out, and as soon as we rolled it out, the business metrics got a lot worse across the board. So we rolled it back, and we were unable to make that change with the current implementation. And this is all to say that right now, in many cases, rendering performance is more important than full page performance. If your page is fully loaded, you might think, okay, I'm done, it happened quickly, that's fine. But if the user can't scroll and interact with the page, and your animations are slow, it's going to really torpedo engagement. How do we fix it? Well, that previous slide I put up has some good advice. Basically, we just use the tools that exist today to hunt down these painful repaints or unnecessary repaints and then fix them. Again, these things come from visually complex elements, but luckily, the designers are telling us today that flat is cool. So it's very easy to have a nice site and a fast site. All you do is just have a flat, no gradients, no background images, no nothing, right? Just flat colors, and then you're good to go on all fronts. But seriously, what are some real techniques that we can talk about today that make an impact on rendering performance? The first is using request animation frame instead of set timeout. Historically, if you wanted to execute something on an often basis, but not as quickly as possible, you use set timeout in JavaScript to delay that event a given number of milliseconds. And people would do things like take 1,000 milliseconds to divide by, et cetera, to try to get 16.6 millisecond execution times. But we'd rather have people use, going forward, request animation frame. This is a native browser API that can optimize these rendering events. It can do things like turn off the animations if the tab is hidden. It can optimize battery usage on mobile devices. And since it's a native browser API, it's just going to be more efficient at doing animations. Support across browsers is pretty good, certainly in modern browsers. You can shim it for older versions of IE, but it's well supported across all modern versions of browsers. Another thing to point out is that consistent frame rate is better than a high variable frame rate. So if you can get your page to render consistently at 40 frames per second the entire time, that's better than having it render at 60 sometimes, but as soon as the user scrolls or an animation fires, it drops down to 30 and bounces back and forth. That's a terrible experience for your end users, so you want to make sure that the page is rendering in a consistent fashion. Another technique is to paint less. So we talked about how having too many paints can be an issue. A lot of the time this comes down to just batching your paints together and trying to do these large updates to the screen fewer times. So just one slightly larger paint that's still within your budget of 16 milliseconds, but not having tons of paints that execute on every scroll event or every hover event, et cetera. You can consider the Translate Z hack. We have some experts on the panel here today that can talk more about that. But essentially, when you add Translate Z0 to an element in CSS, it doesn't actually animate that element, but it does move it to a different compositing layer, which can be very useful for something that's being painted very often. So it'll get put onto the GPU, and the GPU can optimize that. Speaking of the GPU, you want to make sure you're optimizing how often you're uploading textures to the GPU. The GPU is extremely good at manipulating textures that have been shipped to it. But if you saturate that bus between the CPU and the GPU by trying to push textures back and forth, you're going to have problems. So this really comes down to understanding when you're forcing stuff to go to the GPU and trying to make sure you're not doing that too much, but doing it enough to leverage it when it makes sense. And then finally, this comes from a post that was written by Paul Lewis, one of our panelists over here. Don't guess it, test it. It's really hard to give you hard and fast rules for rendering performance on the web today because these are so specific to the site characteristics. It can be a single animation that's causing your problems. It can be a single CSS rule in some cases. So it really comes down to using the tools to find out where your page is slow. If you want more resources, there's a great site put together by some folks at Google, jankfree.org. It aggregates slides, videos, and articles about this topic, and there's a lot of excellent information on there. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the panel.
You want to switch? There, you hold on to that. Okay. We're going to try and get up the contribution screen here. Beautiful. Okay, so let's go to our first question. Pete Miller. I'll get a microphone to Pete.
This question. So, anonymous question here. If there were a Y-slow for rendering performance, what would its tests be? What changes would be easiest to implement and which would have the biggest impact?
Did someone from the panel want to go? Paul, do you have a idea for that one?
I think we covered this in the introduction talk. A Y-slow for rendering performance is, I won't go so far as to say useless, but it's going to be very difficult because what are we looking for? We're looking for layout problems. What triggers the layout problem? Is it that you clicked in this button up here in the top corner? Is it that you were scrolling and we did something parallaxy and that caused a layout problem? You start to get into it's very specific to your application where your problems are going to sort of show up. So having an automated testing framework is going to be tricky. That's not to say we shouldn't try it, but it's not always going to be the easiest thing to do. So it's something that you run in a kind of Y-slow where it goes, hey, you did this and you did this. We should look at it, but I'm not at this point sure how broadly effective it would be.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to automate that, but because Y-slow is partly used as an on-demand tool, that's kind of what the dev tools provide for you today. If you're using Y-slow in the sense that you just pull up a page and run it manually through the Chrome extension, that's what you can do today with the existing tooling and see the rendering performance for your given site. So we sort of have something similar. It's just very, very difficult to automate, as Paul was saying.
So one thing that you can do is to apply specific restriction in your project. For example, Jonathan mentioned about not using request animation frame. So you can put some check in your CI system to prevent somebody from accidentally put that use of set timeout. So if there's a new additional set timeout code appears on some of the JavaScript files, that should trigger a warning because, well, the project used request animation frame by default, for example.
Yeah, I guess the Y-slow stuff normally runs on page load, but obviously all these rendering performance problems are something that's happening as your app is running. So it's not really a way to profile that on initially. So it's basically what we already have now, which is the timeline view of showing all these problems. And Chrome does a pretty good job. I like the new little warning icon you get when you trigger a layout in the timeline. So that's pretty good situation right now.
Yeah, and there are also other things. There are things like telemetry, which Adobe have been using brilliantly for top coat. So when they check in code, telemetry is a Python-based framework that the Chrome engineers use, and it runs a bunch of tests against pages for things like smoothness of scrolling. And that's definitely something I'm interested in looking at a little bit more, because there may be things that we should be looking at that just give us at least an insight into how the change we made in our code affected rendering performance. And it may be that there's a certain amount of scripting that's required from the developers to set this up in a meaningful way for their particular project. But that might be something that we want to take a look at. And if you're interested, give me a shout after this, because I'm actually really interested to find people who want to try it, to bust out telemetry and give it a go.
I think also, I mean, the question is really, what are the magic bullets? I do this on my site and it gets fast. And there's enough things going on in rendering performance in most cases that there isn't a hard and fast rule there. Things are very different on different platforms. So in addition to being specific to your site, it's specific to the device that you're running on. It's specific to the version of the browser that you're running on that device. And so testing is really the best way, and testing on as many devices as possible is the best way, which is not, I'm sure, what everybody who builds content wants to hear. But of course, there are some things that are good and that I think people have started to do a lot more. Being declarative is usually better than being imperative. So if you're going to do an animation, use CSS animations or CSS transitions. Browsers are getting much better at optimizing things that are left up to the browser. And historically, you haven't been able to do that because performance hasn't been good, but now it's a lot better.
Well, thinking about why slow is not just like the specific implementation detail. Like when I think about other people that I work with and multiple levels, you know, are there any big, obvious thing? Like part of why slow's power is just the marketing message that it delivered, you know? We have these things, oh, okay, we should definitely all be gzipping everything, and it sort of consolidated things that had been known.
So I think CSS transitions, as opposed to JavaScript animations, is an obvious one that most people are getting now. My personal one that I've noticed a lot is people really like 1 pixel offset, 1 pixel blurred drop shadows on text. That's a really expensive operation. Don't do that.
All right, I think we'll move on to our next question. Jake Archibald.
All right, so tricks like Translate Z, putting that on an element is quite often a silver bullet in terms of performance. But could that be an anti-pattern tomorrow? Like when we used to tell people to concatenate strings using array.join, and we now know that's faster than just doing string plus string. Is Translate Z going to be the same thing?
Possibly. There are 3 steps, I think, to most performance problems, which is, first of all, there's the don't do it stage, where we just blindly do not do this thing, it will be bad. Then there's the next step where we go, now we can make it less bad if you were to do this thing, which is where I kind of categorize the Translate Z hack. It's something we'd rather you didn't have to do, but sometimes you've got to step in and do it just to kind of hint things up a little bit. Then there's the final step, which is, hey, this is not a problem anymore. Now, there's the other thing where you go, oh, actually, all of a sudden, it's an anti-pattern. So the array concat versus array join versus string concat thing is the one that's often mentioned. And I think the only thing you can do there is profile. Again, we've said it before, but it's like if you're profiling and it's part of your build process, then when something changes in the implementation, you're going to see it. You're going to go, whoa, something went really slow here. I wasn't expecting that. What was it? And you can figure out what it is that's actually triggering your problem. So yes, it may be a problem in the future. There's no crystal ball gazing as far as I can tell, but profile is the answer for me.
Yeah, on that I would say that anytime you're doing something that's known to be a hack, like that's definitely a hack, right? That's probably not going to be something that we want to be doing forever. So anytime that you feel like you're adding some code that's just not standards compliant, or it's Translate Z0 doesn't make a lot of sense from a future proofing point of view, I think it makes sense to abstract that stuff away, because chances are it's going to change going forward because it's not part of a spec. It's just a workaround.
Yeah, one thing I really don't like, if I'm just being me for a second, is the fact that we don't give you a way to say that you want something on its own layer. I think I don't have a problem with the developer saying that. There's a kind of a balancing act of should the developer have to worry about layers versus should the browser just take care of everything. And in a perfect world, yeah, the browser would maybe get everything right for you, be able to guess your intent perfectly. But if it can't, then surely the best next step is not to provide a hack, but to provide a decent API that says, yeah, you know what, if you need to call this, this is what it'll do. And, we actually, if you want to abuse it, okay, that's your call. You're the developer, and we trust you, and you're not an idiot. That's just generally how I feel about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's definitely a leaky extraction.
Right.
Of course. So I think if the layer compositing system is something that you really need to be concerned about as a developer, it should be an explicit opt-in, not going into this magic voodoo property that you read about on Stack Overflow and you don't really understand how it works. But having an explicit API for declaring layers is, I think, a good idea if that's something we need to be concerned about.
So Translate Z0 is obviously a hack to force compositing. And I think it's actually a really good declarative API if right after you put that on or at some point later in your page, you're about to animate the value of Translate Z or you're about to animate the value of Translate 3D. Then you are exactly saying, this is something I'm setting now because I'm going to animate it later. And that's why it does what it does, so that you have your content promoted into a layer so that when you animate it, the next frame is ready. And a number of properties are like that. Those are the properties right now that force compositing, and they're there specifically so that if you are going to animate them, you're primed and ready to go. And maybe there are more things that should be like that, but I'm very hesitant about saying that we should introduce a new property that says promote to layer, because promote to layer isn't something that web developers should care about.
If you don't have that, then you have this thing where developers can't get good performing code. They can't get a good performing app. They don't have anything other than a hack. And so either the browser has to infer perfectly the intent of the developer and get it right, or we have the alternative, which is give them a way of saying, no, this is what I really mean. And they're doing that through this sort of back door at the moment, which kind of makes me feel uncomfortable because it does give rise to, hey, implementation's changed. You know, now your expectation needs to change, which is, I think, a slightly unfair position to put a developer in. But maybe that's just me.
It's kind of interesting to ask what the distinction is between Translate Z and Promote to Layer in terms of actual developer life experience.
Can I jump in for a sec?
Yeah.
I feel like I've seen developers animating top or left, setting something position fixed a lot, and then not realizing that that's going to have different performance implications than animating something with Translate or even margin, right? So I feel like, if we wanted to let someone animate top, but give it the performance of something in its own compositing layer, then using some sort of layer promoting API would make sense in that case, potentially.
I mean, your specific example right now also does force a layer on most platforms. If you set something to fix positioning and then animate top, it will.
Just adding one more twist to the topic. We also have to remember that Translate Z or even compositing layer is just half of the equation, right? For example, if you do that, but you try to animate, say, blur radius or border radius, it doesn't really help because there are only a couple of properties that you can apply to the GPU texture that can be executed by the GPU efficiently. So again, explicit or implicit or half explicit, half implicit, web developers still need to know that only certain properties you can run on the layer itself.
And generally, yeah, I mean, the way I sort of always pitch it is you're going to promote to isolate a layer that's probably going to get painted, or you just want, because you're going to move it, move it, scale it, fade it, or rotate it, I think.
And filter.
Yeah, or a filter. And those Paul Irish actually helped me figure, he came up with those 4, which is really helpful. If you're going to do one of those things, or if you're going to paint something, and it's going to affect other elements, then it's a good time to isolate it. Other than that, it's like you say, it's probably not going to offer you anything, and you're potentially creating more of a problem because you're going to have to upload a texture for that layer to the GPU. And if you're on a constrained device like a mobile one, well, you're going to pay that tax every time you change that layer. So.
One of the interesting things I think about the web that's happening right now is we have sort of two, or not even two, but whatever, a gradient of use cases. Because the browser is now becoming this platform where you can do complex animations, you can do full gaming experiences, et cetera, but you can also build a pretty static website. So when we talk about developers shouldn't have to worry about this, well, if you're building a high-performance game in the browser, you probably should have to worry about that, right? But if you're building your blog, you shouldn't. So I think there needs to be a facility for both camps of people to be able to use these tools effectively without having to worry too much if you're on the low end, but you should be able to access those APIs if you're working on something really complex.
I think we'll move on to our next question. Ben Holland. Grab the mic.
Hey, so we have reasonably good tools and insight into rendering performance in a dev environment, but not data from the field. What events or metrics would we ideally like to be able to measure and report on for real users?
We have the only thing we can do like live in production is measure like the window performance APIs. Those are pretty great, but those only affect the initial load. You don't get anything after the fact. So being able to tap into the timeline from JavaScript and get those actual values would be great. I mean, we do some stuff where we profile method times and then report these back over Ajax in our production app. So, but you can't get access to the timeline data live from JavaScript. So having those would be great.
Yeah, I'd love to have real user data in production as well, but I'd also love to have even better synthetic tooling around it for remote use. So what I mean by that is to say, right now there's no JavaScript API into the frame rate, for example, that the Chrome DevTools gives you for like that rendering meter. So it'd be great if you could just hook into that with JavaScript, because then you could write tools that would basically change different events, hide nodes while scrolling the page, and then read off those frame numbers and the paint numbers. And then you could very quickly narrow down in an automated fashion on the area that's causing a problem. So I think that's kind of the next step, is like, how can we get code around that paint meter so we can easily find out where the problem areas are?
I think that's interesting, but is that in a lab environment or is that in the live? The reason I ask is because if you're talking about live, it's very, say frames per second, it's very difficult to separate signal from noise, because you don't know if it's contention at the OS level, if it's a badly configured monitor, terrible GPU drivers, contention at the Chrome level or browser level, contention actually within the page, and a bottleneck there. So just a simple frames per second probably it wouldn't give you that much, but in a lab environment where you can be pretty sure that there's nothing else running and so on, then that seems to me to be a reasonable first step.
Yeah, I was thinking in a lab, because right now if you want to take a page and figure out why its rendering performance is bad, it takes a lot of work, right? So if you could build better tooling around that in a lab environment, it could be very fast to narrow down on where the problem is. Right. But yeah, you're right, it's not going to work very well in the real world today.
I think we have a question from the room. James Ide.
Hi. So for some context, I feel like a lot of the performance characteristics of how browsers work, like a lot of things in Jonathan's slides, are understood by a lot of web developers, and the dev tools have gone great. Even IE11's really great now, you should check it out. But those understanding how the browser works is great if you're a one-man show and you're building your own web page. And as soon as you start to have a large team working on your product, it's very easy for someone to introduce a regression. So I'm wondering, for example, at Facebook, we have a library called React, which helps avoid layout thrash when we render our web pages. And I'm wondering if there are, I'd say, organizationally scalable APIs that the browser vendors can provide to us. So concretely speaking, maybe asynchronous APIs to decode images, or asynchronous APIs to compute the dimensions of a DOM element, things that are synchronous and slow down the page right now. Are there these types of things that the DOM could provide to us that you think would be helpful?
So I think that's actually one of the most interesting areas of active development in at least most of the popular web engines right now. Definitely WebKit and Blink are both working on, they call it different things, but some sort of incremental layout where certain properties, when you request them from JavaScript, don't trigger a full relayout of the page. And I mean, I can't give you a list of what works right now or anything, because a lot of this is research code right now, but this is a very good example of where the browser can make things fast without you changing anything. So right now, there's a couple of properties that you ask for, like offset width, that will trigger a full relayout of the entire page, and doesn't technically have to. But right now, the way that the engines are work, that's what they do. So stay tuned, but there's a lot of things there that are getting faster without web developers having to change things. In terms of adding new DOM APIs, I mean, we have standards bodies and they accept public comments. And definitely we've seen a lot of people providing that sort of feedback.
We have another question from Mike Petrovich. Mike?
So kind of to Jonathan's point about synthetic testing, I know Etsy does synthetic testing for initial page speed performance. But what if we did something like that with using Selenium test in a synthetic environment that would actually in a context-sensitive area for your app, you know kind of how it's meant to work. Clicking around, 200 milliseconds later, clicking this other element, and that's all affected by different rendering speeds and also JavaScript evaluation. So it's more of a real-world example than just straight up how long did it take to render this. And it's doesn't work at a generalized level like there seems to be a consensus, but on a very contextual basis. What about using kind of automated behavioral tools such as that?
Yeah, so we sort of have that today with web page tests, right? So Pat's here, and he built an awesome tool that allows you to do multi-page flows and sort of see screenshots for every step of the way and look at waterfalls that show JavaScript execution and see how long those things are taking and even monitor CPU during that process. So that's, I think, the best proxy we have for it today. But again, one of the challenging things is that we can't currently get data on frame rate or paint events out of the browser through an API. So that's where you sort of run into that wall. So I think you can get part of the way there, but you still can't like calculate how long a paint takes, as far as I'm aware. Unless you patch Chrome, maybe, I don't know.
No, telemetry actually runs Chrome with a very specific flag, enable GPU benchmarking, which enables a GPU benchmarking API. And that will give you some stuff. And in fact, yeah, that's the reason telemetry can get the data out. The other thing you can do is connect to DevTools. It's over the WebSocket and get it to run, do the thing, pull off the timeline data, and then check for paint records and so forth. So there are things there. They are not, I would say, that easily sort of grunt taskable and just easily inserted into your workflow today. And I think that's something I'm very interested in, is whether we can actually make that a thing that's easy for developers to just include in their build steps.
A good example of the use of telemetry is Adobe Top Code project. I think they have a fantastic dashboard that shows how long does it take to render a button for every single revision of the code, the CSS. So if you accidentally change the CSS and it slows down the rendering of a button, then you'll know it immediately. I think this is all using Chrome telemetry.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Next question, Cheney Tsai. Microphone.
So the question is, how can we track the performance detriment that third-party scripts, such as add, social buttons, or anything you want to add, have on rendering performance? And I guess steps to kind of mediate that without being too hacky.
Come back in 2 hours or whatever.
I think profile. I mean, you should know how your app is running, and then you should know what happens when you add that thing in, and see what the change is. If it's hideous, then you need to make a decision. I think operating blindly with your code is a very dangerous approach. It's just, for me, it is fairly simple. Get used to the tools that are available. They are great tools. And just go make sure you understand how it runs before and after the third-party script to know whether it was worth adding it in. Because the chance, anything you add is going to have a tax, right? It's just whether you're happy to pay the tax, right? That's really the question.
I mean, we've talked a lot about painting. We find that a lot of the issues about badly written third-party code is not so much about painting, but about adding extra event handlers or doing busy work when other things could be happening. And the Remote Web Inspector or Chrome Dev Tools or whatever's available on all the browsers today are really good at showing, like, you had a scroll event and somebody had a non-scroll handler and it ran for 5 seconds and it came from Facebook. Facebook doesn't actually have a scroll handler that takes 5 seconds.
Okay. So let's go on to the next one. Ed Soden.
This was an anonymous question. What is the easiest thing browser vendors could do to make it easy for developers to optimize the performance of their sites?
No.
Isn't that? It's just the why slow question again. Of like, what are these magic things you can do? So,
yeah, I think more to that point. We talked about this in the last section actually, because browsers are now being put on watches and glasses and really low-end phones. It's hard to say like what can the browsers do to just make our jobs easier, because devices keep getting lower powered. So I think we're gonna keep seeing sort of new environments for browsers to operate in, and it's hard to say like, oh well, the browsers will just fix it all. We don't have to do any work.
More tools That's the only thing I can think. More tools, but that's got to be balanced, because you don't want, like, if you've ever used tracing is brilliant, but it's overwhelming at first. When you hit that thing, you're like, what have you just done to my eyes? So it has to be balanced. But I think if we could, for example, you can't actually drill down in Chrome DevTools today inside paint records. You know that you spent some time painting, but you don't know what was painted. We recently added details on image decode and resize, so that you know which image was decoded and resized, which is invaluable. And so we can continue to iterate and improve the tools so that you're in no doubt as to where your bottlenecks came from. But to make your life easier, you're the ones writing the code.
I mean, I make browsers, so I need you to answer that question for me. But one thing that I always ask when I go to conferences like this is I talk to web developers and I say, what are the tools that you need that would tell you things that you can actually act on? So when I ask, what do you need? And people tell me, I want to know what's going on in the paint record. And then you say, oh, but like that will be different tomorrow, or that will be different on a different device by an order of magnitude, which it often is. That becomes information that's very difficult for them to act on. So there are some developers who deliberately target every single device out there with individualized code, but those developers are very rare when you have the kind of money and time to spend on that. So tell us what you need to know, and we will try to make that happen. Also, we try to just make everything fast.
So I have this gut feeling that in the near future, the rendering performance tool, especially with painting, would fall into two categories. One is how to improve from 10 frames per second to 30, and the other one is how to go from 40 to 60 or 58 to 60 frames per second. Because what you're looking for is that quick fix, so that instead of 10, you run at 30 frames per second.
I think we have a question.
So just to say, one thing that you can do is tell us there is a problem. So I think, granted, we don't have best practices exactly at how to solve it, but given, I get the point about doing synthetic testing, but you also, like most people in the panel, agreed that the profile of how many frames per second you get varies per device, and of course you can't simulate all these different situations. If we had some sort of real user monitoring, at least telling us, hey, there is a problem on whatever Android device X on this page frequently enough, then that would motivate me to go buy that device and run some more tests, just to sort of balance the different effects, even ahead of having the best practices for exactly how would I fix my code to make it go away.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and something that brings to mind is that sort of with the YSlow tool release and the web performance movement that's been going on for the past 10 years, we've had a lot of studies that come out saying, look at the top 1,000 Alexa sites and how bad they are in these best practices. That hasn't happened yet, I think, with rendering performance. So I think it'd be useful just to have somebody go out and look at popular sites and be like, look, there are problems here on these devices, on these browsers, and just sort of expose it on a wider basis so people are aware of the problem. Because I think it's in this community, it's obviously well known, but I think in the wider community, people don't think as much about rendering performance.
Does anyone know if Google reduces page rank for sites that are slow?
I'm not saying. No idea.
I'm just asking.
I have no idea.
All right, our next question comes from Dunstan Caston.
Hey, so my experience with paint performance usually drops frames with garbage collection events and memory management. What responsibility should web developers take on for those two things, memory management and garbage collection?
Okay, so I guess the immediate thing is that GC causes jank, because GC is almost guaranteed to push you over that frame budget of 16 milliseconds. Your only option is to try and avoid GC. This, I think, depends on how big a problem this is for you, how much memory churn you actually have, how much time garbage collection is actually taken, and how often it runs, which is going to be very specific to your own application. There are things, we have on HTML5 Rocks, we have an article about using static memory pools to recycle objects and so forth. You're avoiding object creation, which tends to be good for GC. But personally speaking, I don't believe it's. There has been people have requested, can we have a garbage collection API? And I would be concerned about a browser including that, because that one could get really hairy very quickly.
What would be the problems?
The browser is uniquely positioned to your page is not the only thing that's running in the browser, so it's in a unique position to know when garbage should be collected. And if you were to force the issue, you may basically make the wrong call. This is one of these times where, as I say, the browser is the one that has all the information and knows when it's the right time to pick up garbage. Ideally, you want it to do it at the best point for every application that's running, but that's the nature of.
But what if the GC API is just a strong hint for the browser to do garbage collector when it's possible?
So if you do that, then what happens if it ignores you, or you get different browsers ignoring you at different times? Is it any better than the browser just making the call itself?
But that's the same situation like the translate Z layer hacks, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. And so some of this stuff is just real world. Yeah, we're just having to do this right now. We wish we didn't, because we just want to get stuff that runs well.
We've gotten complaints mostly from sites that do permanent animation all the time, that GCs are a problem, and that's things like games. And if you're writing something that is truly interrupted by GCs on a regular basis, then you just have to create less garbage. But building a game that's going to run at 60 FPS while doing complicated things is a hard problem, no matter what environment it's running in and no matter what language you're running it in. So, you can't expect that the browser is just going to do it for you. And I don't think that you could make an easy decision, even if you had a guaranteed API that said GC now, you couldn't make an easy decision about when to call that API.
Well, I'm curious, we hear again and again, and when we talk about rendering performance, we have to test, you have to look at a specific thing. What is the brightest sign of hope for the next thing that's going to be easier to handle? I'm curious if anyone has a perspective.
When you say easier to handle?
I don't know, certain things, in the sense of the timeline view made at least getting a handle on it easier than it was. You could actually see it. I know the inability to see pictures in the, inability to see picture decodes and say, oh, that was a picture decode, that's what that thing was. Having that show up in the tools is an easier thing to deal with. Is there anything that either is going to go away or is going to be much easier to test for?
In terms of going away from a Chrome perspective, there is image decodes and resizes are at the moment extremely expensive. And as we probably know, 60% of the average page is images. So if you can fix image decoding and resizing as a bottleneck, that helps enormously with that problem. So our engineers are definitely looking at ways to make that a thing. The other problem that you often see is the main thread, the contention on the main thread being so high such that work can't continue and the app becomes unresponsive. And we're looking at ways of basically reducing the workload. That doesn't always necessarily mean firing off more threads, which I think is the sometimes mooted idea, which is, we have in Chrome's case, we have a fairly thread heavy app, so just creating more threads wouldn't necessarily solve it. So what you actually want to do is do the work in a smarter way. So for example, putting more work that is suitable for the GPU to go to the GPU, that kind of stuff. From a developer's point of view, none of that actually requires action other than try and reduce the work that you're doing, which has always been the case. If you're layout bound, try and reduce layout. Even if layout gets faster in the browser, you still want to do less of it. The performance is the art of doing the least amount of work.
I think we have a question from the crowd. Saroj? Yes, microphone.
Hi, I have a very simple question. So a few weeks ago, I was developing this web application. I don't have any complicated CSS going on, no timeouts, very simple layout, but it just uses a lot of images. So it picks your images from Picasa and it shows it to you. And it's just slow, especially the first time. The rendering performance is really bad. So what as a developer I can do to increase that performance?
That is a tough one right now, if I'm honest. From my point of view, we don't have. So when the page is rasterizing, it does the image decodes and resizes in line as a sort of dependency. It gets this draw bitmap line where it goes, okay, I now need to draw an image. I now need to decode that image and resize it if necessary, and then I can actually put it in, rasterize it into the page. That all happens in line. If it was decoupled from the rasterization and there was a sort of a gap where it was and then it appeared later, that might be one thing. But as a developer, there's not a lot you can do apart from perhaps batch in your images. Is something you could potentially look at, because if it's all done on demand, so again, this is from a Chrome perspective, it looks at what it needs to rasterize. If that's 30 images are going to get queued up for decoding and resizing in one go. It might be, it depends on the app, but it might be better to just hold off and go, can I do these one by one or just over a few frames so that I'm not hitting everything at once? That sometimes may be a thing, but I offer that advice without knowing the application in detail, so use it wisely.
Does it need to show all those 30 images at once?
So, no, not really, and that was one of the things I tried. Not really, and that was one of the things I tried to do. So, to just show the images, whatever is visible in one page size. But even then, first time you are getting, let's say, 10 images, it's visibly slow. And I've seen similar pattern in other websites too, like the well-known websites. So I wasn't sure if there is anything can be done about it. But yeah.
And we are trying to reduce the tax that is levied for decodes and resizes. But
I mean, we just had a whole panel talking about images. Images are expensive. Having to touch every pixel in an image and doing decodes and things like that is an expensive operation. There's fundamentally no way around the fact that we have to do a lot of work when we show images.
Yeah.
But the techniques that were talked about in the last panel, especially if you control your images, in your case you may not, but putting low quality images in as placeholders and then asynchronously bringing in higher quality versions, or carefully choosing what types of images that you're using, what compression formats, that sort of thing, for whatever's fast on your for your specific operation, is something that you can do to optimize image-heavy sites. But fundamentally, images are expensive. There's no way around that.
It's interesting as a side note that when the last panel was talking, there was obviously a lot of discussion about bandwidth, and that's only part of the picture when you're talking about images, right? Which is the other side of this is, how long then does it take me to decode it and resize it? So you actually need a full understanding. You could save time on the transfer of an image, yay, and then have something that's actually really horrible to decode or is horrible to resize on the other side. So your overall picture is actually either worse or the same or better, but you need to understand the whole life cycle of an image to actually know whether or not you're doing the right thing. And also the low quality placeholder switched out with a high res one could be really good, but then you're also trading off the fact that you probably have a second request to get your higher res image. So it's not just a straightforward, often anyway, and it's very specific to your app, what it is that's worthwhile doing.
It will be interesting to see if in the near future, instead of a single CPU alone responsible for images, we could have a JPEG coprocessors.
Ooh. I think we have a question from Jake Archibald.
Well, he's getting the mic. Image decoding is actually hardware accelerated in many cases.
So the on the scrolling to load images thing, like when they're out of view, use a scroll event to bring the images in. I just wanted to point out that that's a kind of a massive anti-pattern on mobile, because if the radio falls asleep or any device of a cellular connection, waking that radio up comes with a huge latency and will ruin the battery. On the resource priority spec, we've got a new attribute called postpone, which hands that power back to the browser and lets the browser sort of render without it can defer the image loading, downloading if it's out of view.
I would love, as well as deferring the image downloading, I'd actually love the ability to defer it decoding as well. I don't see why you'd have one, not the other. Don't load this. Okay, do load it, fine. But don't decode it. Okay, do decode it, it's fine. That seems to go hand in hand to me, unless I'm crazy. It's possible.
That's exactly the magic of web audio for audio, because decoding the audio is expensive, so you want to do it first so it's ready. Maybe we can do web audio for images. Somebody write us back.
It's a great idea.
Next question Matt Todd.
Hey, this is an anonymous question. What have been the biggest wins and wastes of time at real websites? And I think balancing that between front-end developers and web developers, but also from browser implementation development, what have been really rewarding endeavors and what have been huge wastes of time that have taken more time to actually produce any kind of benefit whatsoever.
We still see a lot of sites that in busy loops add one node to the DOM and then ask for a property that requires you to do a layout, and then add a node to the DOM, and then ask for a property that requires a layout in a really tight loop. And like, this is a huge anti-pattern. We've been telling people this forever. Most people are pretty good about batching nodes dumped into the DOM and that sort of thing, but still a ton of people do this all the time.
I feel like that doesn't happen so much like where you see the tight loop, but it's more so that you have all these other components on the page where one will add something to the DOM, and something unrelated can trigger like a compute style, and it just happens as you render this page. So a lot of it's like uncoordinated. It's not these like little tight, I mean, they're the tight loop things, I think, for painting and rendering, but a lot of people just have all these components, and then some affect the DOM and some require reading. So I think you see that among just having a ton of stuff on your page.
From my point of view, the biggest waste of time I think I've seen would be CSS selector matching, which is remarkably fast. And if you're optimizing your selectors for matching, that's probably not something you're going to see a return on. The thing that I've seen the most use come from would be promoting for isolation, putting elements onto their own layer when they're frequently painted. That's the one I've seen work the most.
I agree mostly on the selector matching stuff, but if you look at some really huge DOMs that have maybe like 30,000 nodes, and you have just a buildup of all this CSS, and typically people have so many descendant selectors that just target like an anchor element. And if you add like a ton of anchor elements in this DOM, that's going to add up. So it's not that every rule matters, but there's ones that you can like call out.
Right, no, for sure. But I would argue that was a fairly extreme case, unless I'm misunderstanding your description. I think for most people and most applications where the DOM is not 30,000 nodes, wow.
It's a GitHub commit diffs.
Boom.
We see a lot of sites that are over 100,000 nodes.
Really? Wow. Just going to let that sink in for a bit.
Jonathan, I was wondering what your experience was.
Yeah, at Etsy, unfortunately, the big wins have been removing content or removing design elements. So like removing drop shadows off of every element on the page kind of thing, and things like getting rid of animated carousels. Sometimes those things are hard to pass through because the designers or the UX people really want that. But at the end of the day, you have to test it, right? And if people want a jank-free experience more than they want drop shadows, then that's what you should give them.
We have a question from John Mum.
Hi, we've talked a lot about images, decoding and resizing being very expensive. Do we know of any example libraries or example implementations that use web workers and transferable objects to have a significant impact on this?
Oh dear, yes, no. I did do actually an experiment with this one, where I actually created canvas elements for all the images and used workers to decode and resize the images. So you can do it, is the first answer. Whether you should do it becomes the next question, and no, it would be because you have to manage all the images yourself. Is it in view? Is it decoded already? Have I decoded this thing before? All these things that the browser does fantastically well for you, you are now having to take care of yourself, and you could shoot yourself in the foot so hard and so fast that I feel duty bound to say you can do it, but don't. But you can do it. And it's cool.
Especially on mobile, I think it will definitely not be a win. So even if you can get the image decoded a couple of milliseconds faster, the amount of time that you're going to be moving pixels around, saturating your memory bus, and the battery impact of running these web workers at the same time is going to be way, way worse than just decoding the images normally.
Because you're going to spawn a new worker, right? So you haven't got enough course, on mobile, probably to support that decision. And it's going to be slower because it's JavaScript. But you are in control. I mean, you are in total control. So that's the trade-off you're making. Control for all that.
Okay, we have another question from Sergey.
We had a lot of challenges explaining network performance, basically the other side of performance, to designers and business people. And a lot of rendering performance actually is much closer to the product. They might actually understand. Do you have any suggestions on how we organize the process for making them understand all of this side of the issues?
Jonathan?
Yeah, I think similar to network performance, you have to kind of show it to them, right? And in a lot of cases, it's a lot easier to see rendering performance being problematic, especially if you have low-end devices that you can show people with. So I think it's a question of getting it in front of them. And like you said, it is closer to the product. It's closer to the design side of things. So I think it should be easier for those people to have it be more intuitive. But I think demonstration is the best option.
Yeah. I think also demoing on cellular instead of Wi-Fi helps a lot.
In fact, just demoing on a constrained device. Pick one. Oh, look slow. Look fast. Which would you rather ship? It tends to be pretty easy then, I think, or easier.
And then one thing that was really successful for WPO was just business metrics, right? And we have some of that data now. It's starting to come out, like from Facebook and like Etsy. So I think showing that information is really important to say, like, this does really impact engagement.
We have a question from Paul Irish.
I think I was going to mostly ask about the same sort of a thing, but I'm interested in ways to kind of communicate what the impact, because like network performance, page load time is a really easy metric. We can track that across browsers, across different connectivity. Rendering perf, there's not much in the way of numbers that we can demonstrate, say, this is the impact that I had, or this is where our problem's at right now, and we need to bring it down here. So do you have any ideas on kind of making things a bit more quantitative so that management and clients can really see the impact that we have, and then understand that there is a problem that we need to solve before we get into it?
Yeah, that's a great question, because everybody quotes these stats like 100 milliseconds on Amazon was 1% revenue, but you can't say like 3 frames per second was 0.5% revenue or something like that. So I think we just have to have real studies that have been done by real companies, and ideally companies that are in your market. So again, it's a tough problem, but I think we just need to have more people doing experiments and be willing to slow down half their traffic to 30 frames per second and see what happens.
Right. I mean, we are now at the point where the browser is capable of 60 frames a second, which hasn't always been true. But now that it is, we're sort of playing catch up with the page load time part of performance, and now we need to ask that question. Say, as an industry, as a body of developers, we are interested, I hope, in seeing how the actual runtime experience affects our users, and whether that's, how much it affects our users. Because we don't know today, is it the same, is it less, is it more than the page load time? Because, they load once, hopefully, and run it for a long time. So, 100 milliseconds different on rendering for page load is a very different deal to, repeatedly hitting them with 100 milliseconds. But we don't know how big that is. So, we don't have a good answer, I don't think, on how much it affects the bottom line. But I think we need to find out, and pretty quickly.
All right, I think that about wraps it up for us. Are we ready for lunch? Someone has a microphone ready to go?
Yeah,
that's fine.
One question. Actually, like, my biggest problem with rendering performance is that I cannot describe my intent to the browser. I cannot describe my intent that I want this element to have higher priority when rendered over another. And I think that's the biggest problem for me when we're talking rendering performance, that the browser is making false assumptions of what my intent is in my layout. I think this goes together with images. This image should be rendered before that. This element, this box should be rendered before this box. What are we doing to look into that, so I, as a developer, can declare my intent to the browser, so the browser can make, or the rendering engine can make a more intelligent guess of how things should be composed when layouting? Because like now we're talking about translate C, that is to me like a hack. First of all, it's not hardware forcing hardware extraction in IE, and I as a web developer, I shouldn't know about layers. That's the implementation detail in the rendering engine. I just want to declare my intent that this layer is either higher or lower priority, and then you guys should figure out the rest. Are we looking into these things? Is there any proposals coming up or?
So there's one, okay, this is, first of all, the browser should do everything for me, is one thing I'd want to pick up on. I don't know how much I agree with that. I don't think I agree with that. I think the way I normally phrase this is if you write spec compliant code, you should expect spec compliant responses from the browser. But there is no promise of performance. Now, the promise comes through the fact that everybody wants fast code. Browser vendors want to give you fast implementations. And so that's something you should seek and you should ask for and you should push for, definitely. But I think it's very difficult to hand on heart say a developer, any programmer should be completely divorced from the system they're programming on. I can't quite bring myself to say that. I think it would be a nice thing, but I don't think that's realistic. Is that something that we are looking to improve? Yeah, always. I think there's always a definite balancing act of APIs. If they're overly prescriptive and you don't get enough control, then you end up with what I think is the app cache situation where you can't polyfill, you can't bridge that gap. If at least if it's too difficult or it's a horrible API, and I would argue that things like WebGL actually are very, very horrible from a developer's point of view, but at least you can polyfill that. You can at least add on something like 3JS. So I'd rather it's that way around. But it comes through developer feedback saying, we don't think this works. We don't like this.
Okay, and I think that is really it.
Thanks very much. So we have a 15-minute break now. So go and have some snacks, go to the loo. Back in 15 minutes. Steve. Right. You're next. Okay. Limbering up. Do some stretching. Hi everyone, we're going to get started again in a few minutes' time, so make your way back to your seats. Thanks very much. Okay, everyone, can you take your seats? We're going to get started with the next session now. So please come back and take your seats. So are you doing his slides? That works. Make a start now. So, our next session is one I've been really looking forward to. Hey, everyone.
Grab a seat!
Thank you, Steve. This next session is one I've been really looking forward to because most large content publishers, including the FT, have a lot of third-party scripts that they put on their websites, and managing those scripts and managing the performance implications of having a lot of third-party scripts can be a really trying experience for a lot of web developers, and it's certainly a challenge that we struggle with every day. So to moderate this panel, we have my friend Steve Thayer, who I'm sure will introduce himself and his panel admirably. So over to Steve.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you, Bob. Hi, my name's Steve Thayer. I run the London Web Performance User Group, and I run Web Perf Days in London. So, performance of third-party scripts is a really big area for us, and we debate it endlessly. I'll quickly introduce you to the people on our panel. Sort of on my right, I've got the well, if we're going to do a drug dealer analogy, these are the guys who are actually producing the stuff. We've got Ben Vinegar from Discus, who are discussions and comments you'll have seen on many websites. We've got Stoyan Stefanov from Facebook, who is like buttons and all those kind of Facebook widgets that you like to put on your page. And over here we've got Guy Podjani from Akamai, who's sort of like the middleman, the distribution network for the stuff that they're dealing. And then we've got, I was going to say addict, but that's probably not right. We've got Barbara Burns from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. She's the kind of end user, this poor person that's having all of these scripts. She has to sort of deal with her customers, the people in the marketing team who never met a third-party script they didn't like. And they just want to stick all this stuff on the page, and she's got to deal with all of those issues. So we're going to kick off with a presentation from Stoyan, just to sort of set the scene on what third-party stuff means. Just remember, obviously, we've got the on-slide stuff, so try and use that as much as you can. Come in, give positive and negative feedback, and obviously put your hand up via on-slide if you want to talk. Thank you. Over to Stoyan.
Thank you, Stephen. All right, so welcome to the third-party party, where we party like it's 1995, because in many ways it is 1995 when it comes to third-party widgets. So I'm hoping we can have a nice discussion how to bring this party to today and tomorrow. Slide, please. So Stephen now do the same thing that I was planning to, so he stole my thunder of presenting the widget makers versus the consumers. I can only add that Stephen is also on the ops side. He's also on Barbara's side, right? So protecting...
Impartial moderator.
Protecting all the publishers from all the extravagance we put out there. All right, so just a quick overview. Third-party content comes mostly in form of script that you include on the page. It may not do anything visible, like it may be something like Google Analytics, or you put an iframe on the page coming from a third party, or the state-of-the-art seems to be that you do both. You include a script that writes an iframe for you. So that we focus, we want to talk more about how we deal with scripts and iframes. And yeah, you're including a JavaScript on the page coming from somewhere you don't know, you have no control over, coming over the network. So what could possibly go wrong with that? Well, obviously there's a security issue, and Ben wanted to bring up a recent attack on Outbrain, which is a producer of third-party recommendation engine. So it was attacked by Syrian army folks who were able to mess with their JavaScript, and in this way affect all the pages that use their service. So let's say, for example, they could redirect all the visitors to Washington Post to some other page. So I think if you're an attacker, if you're a malicious person, why would you try to break into all these websites where you can do your one-stop shopping and break into a third-party widget provider and have control over so many websites? Right, so security is obviously a big one. And then you have the SPOF, or single point of failure, where if a page includes a script synchronously, they add a single point of failure. And despite the fact that we have now good tools from Pat Meenan's Puffomatic extension for Chrome, and also you're able to find Puff in using web page test, but it seems like that still tends to be an issue, which is pretty silly, because if the third-party provider is blocked in a country or an enterprise, that means your site is effectively blocked as well, or black-holed. And then there's all the performance issues, right? Anything you add on the page will add to the rendering time and loading time and all that. All right, so what does the state of the art of script includes? So despite all the evangelism for using asynchronous scripts, people still using script tags, and sometimes the widget providers on the marketing side will prefer that because it's easier. You just have one script tag instead of a little bit of code. So that's pretty bad. There's currently some things on the crazier side, like using frame-in-frame. Loading a JavaScript inside of an iframe, or when you write an iframe, write it inside of another iframe. So the first iframe container is blank, so it's not in the way of the window onload event. So this is for people who still care about the window.onload and whenever it happens. Not as easy, but or friendly to copy paste, but it exists. Something else, so the thing about third-party JavaScript is they're notoriously being very short-lived, 10, 15 minutes, half an hour. And the reason is so that the third-party provider can push fixes and security updates and very quickly. But that's bad for performance because we cannot use far future expires header. So there's this technique of, again, using an iframe and reloading that iframe that causes the script to be refreshed, so you can have a third-party JavaScript with a far future expires header. And I don't know if anyone's doing it currently. Sosta, all right. And then there's stuff that's coming up from the WebPerf W3C group, which I was hoping someone can enlighten us what's going on there with the progress. Right. Next. Oh yeah, there's this idea about what I call it C3PO, or common third-party object. So the thing is, so this is something I put up some time ago, and then Ben said that he's been thinking about the same thing, but we never really got to talk. So I think that's as good time as any. So the idea is that those scripts that are included from third parties usually do the same thing. They hunt the page for any hints where the iframe should go. So they look at the DOM and then write an iframe and then resize the iframe because the content doesn't fit. Let's say you have, I don't know, like button in German, which is a longer word. So you have to resize the iframe not to take more space than needed. And a lot of widget providers are doing the same thing. So what if we can have one script that is open source and that handles this for most of the widgets? So this means that the publisher can include this script and package it however they want with their scripts and handle all the widgets. So while you download 5-6 scripts with 100, 200K instead of having just 0 requests. So that is the idea. Meanwhile, in what we have in nearer future coming up, so we have now web components. I don't know if anyone's using web components. If not, why not? Seems like the widgets are the best use case for web components. Then I'm thinking, is it any easier on the publisher side to include a web component instead of the current state where you include a div class, something, and the script. There's the iframe sandbox. It's really cool. Should we encourage people to use it or not? What would you disallow in a third-party widget? So there was the idea of seamless iframes. Seems like it's not it's not going anywhere, going away. The same with the frame SRC doc. I don't know if what's the state of that? Is it dying as well? So we can talk about this.
It just got a negative vote.
content security policy. It exists. It's out there. What should we do about it? Should we encourage people to use it, providers as well as publishers? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. But meanwhile, what happens now, and Barbara can talk about this from the publisher's perspective. So she said that sites are now bombarded by scripts. So there's too much stuff going on. And she was also, like Stephen said, challenging anyone to stand between the marketing people and their widgets. Right. So how do you monitor third-party widgets? Do people set up budgets and say, okay, you have this amount of time or K, or how do we keep the third parties in track? Also, how do we deal with some, because not all the third-party code is very well written, right? So how do people deal with the scripts that have to do document write and so on? Guy brought a good question about that according to the HTTP archive, the number of domains every website is using is going up, is increasing, and it can be largely attributed to third parties. So what can we do to fix this? And he has some ideas, some borderline crazy, like copying cookies from one domain to the other, some maybe more manageable, like what if we use the same domain name for all the static resources, scripts and styles and sprites, and shared between all the third parties. So instead of loading something from Facebook, something akamai.net, whatever, why don't we use something else, like a common domain name? C3PO comes to mind.
I think it would be c3po.akamai.com.
Oh, mobile, right. It's finally here. Yay. What does it mean for widgets? Is it only just making performance issues even more visible? Should we do something about it? Are people using mobile, using that many widgets on mobile websites? Curious to know. Yeah, I think that's all I had. And let's talk about all this stuff. Yeah.
Well, thanks very much, John. I'm just going to do a quick poll of the panel. Guy, any quick comments from Stoyan's opening talk?
Sure. Maybe I'll add a couple. One is, in general, third party is a little bit broader than that. I think there's some bias to think about. Every person has a bias, but there's also tracking beacons, which for some websites are plentiful and actually come in often in the form of an image. And there are also actually third-party components that are more inline in your page, all sorts of shopping cart personalization components and such that are, I guess, kind of start to tread the line, because while they're third-party, they're not extraneous to the sort of core flow or requirement of the product. But there's still a concern, and all sorts of things like number of domains and reliability concerns, security concerns are still very much valid for them. So that's one point. And then the second one is just to sort of highlight the aspect of the number of domains. There's basically the problems with third parties that have to do with best practices around how to use them, how to write them if you're an author of them, to try and get them out of the way as much as possible while still kind of keeping them reasonably fast. And there's also things that are just trends, like the number of domains or like the existence of unoptimized third-party scripts that use document.write, whether you like it or not. And those are just paths that to me are more interesting, because there's no clear, as far as I know, there's no good set to advance us in the right direction. Cool. To fix those.
Okay.
Barbara?
So yeah, for me, I'm basically really in the middle of both. So I want to make sure that the developers understand what third-party scripts really could do to your page, and also the business side, to tell them what to look out for when asking third-party providers to provide their code.
So you're saying it's not really possible to tell the marketing department they can't have that piece of code because it has a document.write in it, because they just won't understand.
Exactly. You gotta explain to them what the impact actually is. Yeah, and they don't always understand that.
Okay. Cool. So Ben, as a provider, what would you say about Stoyan's opening marks?
I mean, they're really good comments. I think that basically it's been set up that this whole panel is sort of like, if you're a website publisher, and then third-party scripts are mean and we're villains, also Stoyan. But I want to flip this around. Like, maybe people aren't thinking that as a third-party developer that has a pretty complex application that I'm serving to publisher pages, there are publishers that are doing really bad things to me. and I would love to talk about some of those and what can
Yes.
So, and I don't even mean that partially as a joke, but there's definitely, it can be subjects like people immediately attribute performance issues to a third-party script. That's the first place that they go, where I'm debugging publishers' websites, and then I attribute basically the performance problems back to them. So I'm sort of in a hard spot as well, and I think that's, I don't know, possibly worth discussing.
Cool. I think we've actually got some couple of questions about how we can find and identify those sort of performance bottlenecks. But first question we've got from the floor is actually from Yoav Weiss. Yoav, oh, you down there?
Hi. What are the mechanisms for enabling script loading based on media queries? And is there a valid proposal? And how can we get this pushed?
So this is the idea of if I've got a script that's just not relevant for the device that I'm running on, why am I downloading it in the first place? Things
Exactly. It relates to the mobile thing. I mean, if I don't show a like button on mobile, why am I downloading the script?
Do you want to start taking that one?
I don't know. I'm not aware of any development. Are you? Is there a proposal going on?
I started playing around with the idea. The thing, it's kind of hard to define what happens when the media query changes. That's where things get complicated. Do I want to run the script or not? But in general, do you guys think it's a good idea, or is it something that should be pursued?
It definitely sounds interesting. So, yeah.
I'm kind of fond of it. So I think the notion of conditional loading, especially in responsive design website, is a real issue. And in responsive design, we focus on images, like we spoke earlier. But maybe the next looming problem, if not already here, is the notion of scripts. And I regularly see responsive websites download, execute scripts, and then hide them because the layout doesn't quite make sense for them. So institutionalizing or standardizing conditional loading makes perfect sense to me, and using media queries seems like one way to do it. Not sure if there's any active conversation about it, so I guess we're probably going to need to figure out all the different options of it. But I do think that's a good path that we need to go down.
I think also the idea is interesting, but I'm also wondering, so why would you, what are the use cases? So you would not load, for example, a Facebook button for mobile versus desktop or whatever?
The use cases I can think of are Facebook button or social buttons in general, maps that may or may not be displayed because you want to go to the native map, and jQuery mobile, I mean UI frameworks where you want to load jQuery mobile here and jQuery UI there, or these are the use cases I have in mind.
Yeah.
And Twitter streams, I think, are a common one in responsive design.
Or even we're doing different ad serving for desktop versus mobile, for example, yeah.
We've got a couple of comments from the floor. Kyle Simpson from Getify, did you have something to say on this topic?
I didn't actually intend to click that, but I'll just say something because I do have a question. Since they gave me the mic.
Okay.
It's your time.
But no, on that topic, though, so there is definitely a strong push to create declarative solutions like markup only stuff. I need to be able to express all of my intent through markup. But I do just want to point out that there's a vast array of complex situations that you make these decisions on. For instance, I've got a simple version of a calendar widget and a complex version of a calendar widget, and I make decisions based upon bandwidth and screen size and all those other things. So I think it's troublesome to say this is a one-size-fits-all solution to try to encode into my markup when a script should be loaded. I feel, I'm a little biased, but I feel that's the job of script loaders rather than markup.
I mean, I think that's a valid statement, but there's also the statement to say that, especially in responsive design world, there are a lot of decisions that are made based on things that could have been determined through screen properties. So maybe it's not 100%. You don't take away the capability or the value of loading things through a more elaborate script-based loading condition. But if it's a common enough use case and you can make it faster and easier, then I still think it's a worthy proposition.
We've got David Stickman from Akamai wants to make a comment. Feel free to disagree with Guy from Akamai.
At least briefly.
Just
Hi.
One of the most common use case we see is actually tons of new domain, and people tend to do domain sharing thinking that it's going to improve the performance of the website, but obviously with third party we have 40, 50 different domains that are called by the browser. Is there any way we can give a hint of what kind of DNS resolution should be done for third party content before actually loading the third party itself? Because there is a lot of bottleneck with just DNS resolution itself.
Anyone?
I can take that because I know. So I think the number of domains, is kind of pointed out before, is this has not been coordinated. Just to kind of make sure, is a real problem. It comes into play in DNS. It comes into play with the fact that speedy and HTTP2 and all sorts of pending solutions don't touch on it. They don't try to optimize across domains. So I think it's a real problem. There is no deprioritization, as far as I know, of third-party content. You can kind of mark things beyond the async or the kind of processing aspects in the browser. You can't mark something as slower or faster. So I think they contend for resources today. A part of it is about how do we optimize the number of domains, and today the only tools you have for deprioritizing them is to do things like async and such.
Okay. We're gonna come on to a later question. We're going to talk more about dependencies and execution time, but just to sort of stick with this, the original intent of this question was, in the earlier session we talked a lot about how you were going to do media queries to decide what image you want to download. Do we need a similar mechanism for scripts or not? I mean, if you were to put it to the audience on a vote, do you say yes, we need this mechanism, or we don't need a mechanism for this and we can just move on? Is this a problem that you think? I'm sending way too many third-party JavaScripts to my so we got 2 votes, 3 votes, 4 votes, 5 votes. So people do think this is a problem. That's not just Yoav hitting the button 5 times.
I have several accounts.
And friends.
Okay.
I would just say that, I mean, we experience that people are conditionally loading our application, usually doing templates or JavaScript or whatever already. So, I mean, if that can just be a really nice declarative way of doing that as opposed to setting up, JavaScript code, I don't see the problem with that. Yeah. People are doing it already, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Whatever the developer wants to do, if it's easier for them, and if media queries enhance the performance as well in loading things, I think, if you make it easy for them to use that as a publisher again, then that's cool.
I will say it's not just third party though. So conditional loading of JavaScript on a responsive website is broader. Third parties are a specific case of it.
Okay, so let's go on to the second question. We've got Tom Bushok. Bushok.
So this one came in anonymously as well. The WhatWG has proposed the solution for managing script dependencies and execution time. Will this solve the performance and blocking use cases? And Kyle, I believe, actually is part of that proposal, so maybe he'll have some helpful input as well.
Okay. So this is sort of, as I understand, it's related. There are a lot of hacky ways people download scripts as comments and then add them dynamically to the page when they need them. There's a lot of hacks out there that are people doing to get around the async, the blocking nature of the scripts. So what's happening with the working groups and what's the best solution for this?
I am not familiar with this topic.
Go.
Anyone from the audience who wants to take it?
Yeah.
Kyle? Or
I can give a starting and then maybe we'll switch to Kyle. But so I think there's a few things there. There's one in kind of called resource priorities that has to do with enabling lazy load and defer attributes on more objects. Those are actually probably further along on scripts than they are on some other components. But there are some promise there. I think there's still a lot of debate, and I heard some comments in a previous conversation today on possible paths, but I think there's still a hole around how do you manage groups of dependencies so that you want to say this script needs to run after the other, but both of them combined should be asynchronous. There's things around association of onload, triggering the onload event, and an async script, because an async script today would still delay the onload. So I think on the loading process, there are some good actions. On the grouping and such, I would find them very promising, but I don't know if they're very far along.
So since my name was brought up, I will speak up. So 2 or 3 years ago, there was some proposals. Nicholas Zakis and I kind of joined together and made some proposals on Whatwig about what we call script preloading. So the idea of loading a script, but it not automatically executing the way normal scripts do, and then being able to programmatically control when that script might load. And that has gone through a whole bunch of starts and stops and restarts over the last 3 years. Most recently, about a month ago, it started back up. It turns out there's several different things, and maybe Jake Archibald can also chime in. So there's some stuff with navigation controller, and then there's discussions about other use cases that might not handle. I don't think I would classify us as far along in terms of implementation, but there has been an enormous amount of discussion about it, and developers do want, I think, more control over it. There's one side which is I want control in the markup. Again, back to this declarative versus programmatic control, and I think that's really one of the big sticking points so far.
Okay. Jake, did you want to say anything since you got called out?
Yeah, I think the worst thing we've got with script loading at the moment is if you want to load a series of scripts without blocking rendering or blocking any of the computing, but maintain the order of execution, we don't have that unless you use JavaScript. And we don't want to use JavaScript for script loading because then you lose the preloader. And the preloader can, you can boost getting to DOM content loaded like by 20%. So we want something in the markup that can dictate which order that scripts will be executed, and then load them asynchronously.
Just specifically related to third party, I do think there is another barrier, which is document.write. So when you're using a third party, when you're a publisher and you're using a third party, you need to sort of be absolutely confident 100% that script would never ever use document.write if you're including them as an asynchronous component. Otherwise, that can muck up your entire page. And as far as I know, there is no work going on right now, but there definitely should be on doing something like that. Heck, even something like just ignoring the document.write in many cases would be better than blanking out the page and writing only that piece instead of the entire page. But ideally, there's something a little bit more elaborate than that can after the fact, write content in those sections.
Okay, so I'll say we got Wilson's got his Wilson Page from FT Labs has got his hand up to comment on this topic, hopefully.
Hello. As a web app developer, I like to have control over my resources. So would it be possible that third parties like Discuss might let me bundle those resources, their third-party scripts into my JS bundle or other assets like CSS? I mean, I can see why you wouldn't want that because you'd want control. I mean, you want the control to be able to update when you want it updated, but I also don't want 100 HTTP requests going off on my page. So.
Yeah. Oh man, a lot of eyes on me here. On some level, I mean, I'm a web developer too. Yeah, I hope so. And I would like to do that. Sort of makes sense. But you basically just hit the other end of it, which is we're just changing things at such a rapid pace that for somebody to bundle it and serve it from their own servers or whatever is just like, we can't do it. And this actually touches a little bit on some of the C3PO stuff, which is if there's the idea is that if we had like a common library that ran on your host page, and then you could bundle that part, and then the stuff inside of the frames could then do whatever they wanted, and you at least got that much out of it. Even on that point, I could just inevitably I might want to do something different, and now I have to go around to thousands of websites and say, please update this library in order for you to have the next version of Discuss. And that is it's just such a ridiculous pain point to go to. The way that scales is that there's one of me and there's thousands, or I think there's basically millions of websites with Discuss, and to go and get all of them to upgrade all of their bundles or whatever it would be brutal. So that's just why we don't explore it.
Well,
so no.
As a publisher, I mean, what we do, we have our libraries like jQuery and all that stuff. We know will not change that often, so we compile them or bundle them up in one request, right? But then, yeah, of course, the widgets that could change any minute. You gotta find a solution for that. Yeah.
Okay.
We do some proxying of third-party content sometimes, and there's a different flavor of it. So, on the good side, if you proxy third-party content through your servers, your CDN, then you kind of regain control over some availability tests, over the performance delivery of it. They may not be delivering it as kind of high quality, or we're not willing to spend as much on the delivery controls as you might be. Where that really runs into an obstacle is with things like tracking. So like on Facebook, you could probably pull that off with a Facebook SDK, which is generic and cacheable, but you wouldn't be able to do it with the iframe that figures out which of your friends recommended this, because that requires some special cookies, and once you moved it off to a different domain, those cookies no longer get sent. So to me, if we are to do something like a C3PO or some equivalent of it, we should tackle that, because our assessment, we've done some sort of kind of mass testing on it, and was that really qualifies a lot. In order to move something to a different domain, you need to be absolutely sure that there would be no cookies associated with that request, or even if you're doing cookie syncing, there would be no cookies other than a session ID cookie on that domain, and that's just a very tough restriction. So we would need to standardize how that is being handled if we wanted to go down that path.
Okay, I think we'll kind of come back to that 3PO and shared cookie things in a later question, but I think there's an interesting question there for the browser vendors. Have we actually made this problem for ourselves because we can't share cookies and domains for security reasons? We've actually created this problem, and there needs to be some way to address it, because effectively there's an ecosystem of people that want to share this data. There is no effective mechanism that I'm aware of anyway that can do that. But next question we've got is from Wes. Oh, Calvin. Sorry, Calvin.
The problem with document write was mentioned earlier, and the need to make sure your async loaded scripts don't have any document write tags. I work with an environment where I have hundreds of unknown vendors, including third-party scripts at any time, and I have no way to ever vet them all, because they come from 150 different properties. And we currently use a tool called write capture to override what document.write does and force asynchronous loading of everything. And it's awful, and when it breaks, it gives me a headache for months at a time. We can never get rid of that. Or actually, my question is, can we get rid of that? Is there anything we can do so that we can stop having to vet these and know that they're not going to do document.write? Because the surprise is awful if it ever happens.
So you want like a flag on the browser or something to say this page doesn't support document.write or something?
We add APIs all the time. Can we do the opposite just once?
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're going to start like that kill IE6 campaign. You're just going to start a website, kill document.write.
I would be very happy with that.
Sorry? Who would vote for that one?
Wait, what am I voting on?
Kill document.write. Just get rid of it.
Sure, yeah. I mean, we could start a trade association too, in which we, vet scripts. I don't know. I'm not being serious. This is a terrible joke.
So we do the same thing of the write capture as part of the kind of optimizations we do in Akamai, and I kind of share your pain, and I think. I'd like to believe that browser vendors should be able to tackle that. I don't know if any browser vendor in the crowd wants to chime in by doing some 90% accurate version of the document.write, just kind of write that out in spot where that script would have been after the fact. Because oftentimes just killing document.write or trying to mock it up in JavaScript is it's the best we have, so we use that where needed, but it's extremely far from ideal.
We've got to move on to the next question. So next question is actually from Wes.
Okay, so Facebook has recently taken steps to optimize the scripts for its embeddable like button, which I think you guys can speak to. But how do we measure the impact of embedding these scripts? And then a second part to this question is the web intent specification our only hope to kind of conquer app linking and embedding these scripts? Is web intents kind of our hope for not having these types of share buttons and scripts that are included with those?
Okay. Well, I might throw this question to Barbara actually as a consumer. I mean, do you do performance testing and like somebody comes to you and says, I want to add this new third-party script. What do you do to measure the impact of that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm big on performance, and obviously I have issues when 50% of our CBC desktop site is serving third-party scripts, and the rest we're serving to the customers is just our own content. So I do try to do that. It is very difficult for us to make sure that all the content areas at CBC know about it again and how to include it. So in terms of performance, I do performance tests, especially the A/B. You know, what happens before putting the script in versus after. And we've seen some really bad incidents where ads or scripts like that slowed down our site. So to track those kind of things and give them to business and say, see, this is what could happen. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What about from your side, Stu?
Well,
what do you do to make sure yours is not so slow?
Well, when optimizing the like button, right, then the only thing you can do is write a blog post and see how the waterfall is so nice now.
But it is. That was good.
Yeah, I don't think we're doing anything to prove, okay, this is, I know how much it reduces the average website and so on. So just trying to do the best thing and then let other people measure and see how it affects their websites, right? And yes.
That's good. So, I mean, Ben, you said earlier that you do a lot of debugging of the customers' websites because they always blame you for the performance issue. So what are there tools, are there techniques, are there tips, is there a methodology that you follow to prove that it's the sucky customer website and not your awesome script?
That is exactly how I phrase it. It goes over really well. I mean, there's a ton of techniques that, I mean, are pretty well published out there that I probably using. I don't even know why I'm saying we there. I don't know. In my mind, like a lot of these they're very tried and true performance things, like not binding to, debouncing, throttling scroll handlers, or something we do is we render in chunks now. So we release to the browser, we'll render 5 comments, release to the browser, render 5 comments, release to the browser. We're very cognizant of just never tying up the UI thread. I don't think that's something that I can, it's just like an individual widget developer or third-party application developer, they all sort of have to do that. And I think the big issue is that they don't, or it's just all over the place as to whether they do. Might be rambling here. You can bring me back.
Well, I guess the question is, so if we take an example of where you said that that you've proved that it wasn't your script that was blocking the site.
Yeah.
Was it a case of was it something that the customer was doing that was impacting your script in a negative way, and how did you prove that?
Well, I mean, the last time I was debugging the site, I think this was just me myself, or I brought this on myself in the sense that I was observing that Discuss was slow when scrolling through it on a blog. And I actually think today that's actually a lot of CSS performance, which is another topic that I will address. But so I was debugging our scroll handlers and figuring out that in this case, the parent website was not throttling a scroll handler, and they were activating it as you went over Discuss. So you would scroll down, and it would actually sort of chug a little bit. I don't remember the purpose of it. This is just a random anecdote of something.
Might be also nice to automate that somewhere on your side, or on your end, that you can say, okay, publisher A is not using it properly, or don't blame us, if the site is slow.
We've got Matt May from Adobe. Do you have a comment on how you measure the impact of these scripts? Well, we'll hold that question then. We'll try and stick with the topic.
Yeah, I've got one comment on it, maybe to
Go.
throw in, which is that resource timing is kind of hopefully going to help us identify in real users where to lay the blame. There are some security aspects to resource timing, but from my perspective, when somebody comes to Akamai and says, you're not making my site faster, sometimes the purpose is to sort of show that it's actually the third party that's on your page that's the cause. At least we kind of put a lot of hope in that in that front to give us clarity about whether who's sort of truly to blame for the problem, and therefore where should the solution lie.
Okay, Sergey, did you want to make a comment?
actually been working for a while with vendors that work with us on enforcing the contract between the groups, but one of the lines was never use document.write. The question is, can we create or promote kind of this contract between widget providers of different kind, surely, and publishers, and kind of help emerging providers, which I have to deal with a lot, to follow that at the same time, probably protect some widget providers' needs as well.
I would love that. We talked about that, some sort of a policy, and I would love to create a policy that we could give to the widget creators and say, okay, if you follow those steps, we would consider you using. And I think it is important to make that point. Yeah.
Maybe able to copy some of the security policies we're doing. We're talking about sandboxing from that perspective. So say, well, I'm only giving you a constrained access to certain APIs. You're not allowed to use document.write. It's just going to break.
Well, there's this organization called, I forgot what the name was, Interactive Advertising Bureau or something like this. So they've released...
The IAB. Yeah.
IAB. They've released a document saying, related to ads. So these are the best practices for ads, right, that kind of stuff. So do we need something similar for...
Yeah, or just an enforcement of it in the browser.
But I don't think there's any, okay, this is the checklist that you have to follow, otherwise you're not given an A or...
Okay, so we'll switch on to the next topic. Marcus? Stand up.
So this is an anonymous question. The growing use of third-party services means web pages today consume content from over 16 domains on average, creating performance and reliability problems. Speedy and HTTP2 work per domain and don't help. Can we share connections or delivery across third parties?
Yeah. So I guess this is really the point to discuss the 3PO idea and you know, particularly when the areas I deal with a lot with this is like affiliate tracking, and you're trying to attribute, you know, the affiliate referral fee to somebody, and so all of these affiliates are coming from different domains and different affiliate tracking networks, and you know, I've got to have that script on my page. It's part of the business model of the customer I'm working in. But you know, if all of these things were put into one centralized domain, or there was an effective mechanism for sharing and synchronizing the cookies across the domains, you know, that would help me a lot. Is that something that we can do, or do you think that's never going to happen?
Yeah, well, I really like the idea. So there's many things that we can optimize, right? First is the script that writes whatever the widget is doing, the iframe, and so on. So you know, having this as packaged together with the publisher's script sounds great. We have to make sure that it's absolutely future-proof, because people might not upgrade it once they get it off GitHub. Then the other thing about the common domains, right, after you have already written the iframe, right, all the static resources on that iframe, could they be sharing the same domain? That would be cool. So you don't have to deal with, so you still have to make a request to the third-party provider to get the HTML, any loggings and that kind of stuff. But when it comes to static resources, why not?
Ben?
So with the idea, like maybe we have like 3pjs.cdn.com, and we just sort of, everybody has like, we have 3pjs/Facebook/discuss, and we just, that's where we put our static stuff, and then we benefit from having a single domain. Is that basically the idea? Is that, try to help me understand here?
Yeah, I think there's two aspects of it. There's the standardizing of how something gets included on the page, which would help alleviate some of the concern with, you know, nascent third parties or third parties that don't put as much effort into it. And then there's the delivery aspect of, which was around, having some shared. I guess there's the ideal would be maybe a single domain. There are all sorts of security aspects to putting content from multiple providers on the same domain, so that might not be an option. So maybe at the very least, it is share connections for those components to sort of deliver them where possible through the same entity.
Well, so much of this has to be done client side because it inherently wants to read a cookie to find, what other website that you went to, so I can do my affiliate tracking and things like that. If we had some kind of shared mechanism, could we move a lot of this server side? Are there any effective server side solutions? So I can just take all of the scripts off my page. Is that feasible? What would we need to be able to move some of this stuff server side?
Well, I think you need, for the server to be able to pull in content from multiple domains, you need, for starters, you would probably need, for many of these third-party services, you'd need some cookie syncing capability because they track different IDs. Now, cookie syncing is a solved problem in ads, so that can be done. But then the second problem is non-ID cookies. And that's not at all a solved problem. So we would need basically a commitment from anybody participating in this, from the Facebooks that discuss of the world, to say, I will keep everything server-side, maybe even provide some supporting mechanisms for that, and work fully on a session ID. And then, of course, then the politics kick in about who owns that ID, but that's, we'll leave that part for later. And on top of all of those, you would need the browser to share connections if you didn't literally land on the same domain. So you'd need to somehow have the browsers play ball on that front.
And of course, for a publisher, it would be great to just include something or run a script somewhere and include all the things that you need. So that would help for sure. Yeah.
I would say there is a lower bar around sharing, at least, or delivering them from a standard component for providers. So if providers had an easy way to know which resources of their third parties are things that they could pull into their content, then I think that would be a big step forward. I mean, we had to do conversations with Facebook, with Google, with various others to learn that, I believe the Google Analytics JavaScript library, the Facebook SDK, those components are static, but you basically don't know those without very explicit statement from the browser vendors. Sorry, the third-party vendors.
No questions from no comments? Okay, we'll move straight on to the next one. Andre Behrens.
Hi, and this is an anonymous question. If a blocking script is loaded from a domain that goes down, then this will cause my page to fail to load. How can we test and or address the single point of failure issue?
Well, I guess I'll go to Barbara. Single points of failure?
Yeah.
Is this a real problem that affects your website?
Yeah, I would say so. And I see sometimes even script being not properly included on the CVC domain. Literally, ad hoc, you could use like Pat's Spoofomatic, right, to check how your site is behaving with third-party scripts. I also like SPOF check, I think the eBay team did that, so you can pull that into your continuous integration, so we can right away, when somebody develops something, we could right away figure out that they're including scripts not properly, and then avoid that potential failure. And we've had that happening as well, even I think last week with ads, where something was not properly included, and we got some bad hits for that, yeah.
So you were able to check during the build process that somebody somewhere included the block?
Yeah, exactly. So it literally checks for script, and if you just put it wherever it is, it's a really cool tool. And there's even, I think, a Grunt plugin as well that you can use. So this is, I would love to have those kind of things more integrated in our deployment, so that basically as a developer you can almost be dumb. So you just don't have to think about it, and we catch that, and we're not able to deploy stuff. Yeah.
Important to clarify that the SPOF is the extreme scenario, that kind of, this website is down, and maybe a slightly more rare one, but a mini version of it happens every time the page is loaded. Like any one of these blockers is also some sort of delay, some sort of resource contention for each one of those resources. So, sometimes the conversation goes into, Facebook's not going to go down, which, it's a different conversation, but there is always a little bit of a penalty, even for the kind of most cutting edge third parties. So getting them out of the line of fire is always a good idea.
Yeah, and what I was saying is it may not be down, but it may be blocked in the company, or you don't want people on Facebook during working hours and so on. So you effectively destroy the website because Facebook is blocked for some reason.
Cool. Kyle Kinnaman, it's been answered? Okay, cool.
I was just going to add really quickly that, other than, I guess, the case where somebody just puts in a blocking script tag, there's that problem. I do think that third-party applications and third-party scripts we absolutely have to be good citizens, and we have to work in situations where stuff is down or wherever. I know that a big push that we're making in our company is that if Discuss goes down, we at least want you to see static comments that are basically not dynamic. You can't, the server's not going to listen to you because maybe it's blowing up, but at least you can read comments, and for all intents and purposes, that's just static. It's from a CDN, and things look okay. But it's like, I don't, this is just stuff that we have to do, and I don't know if there's just like a hammer that everybody can just use for that.
If everybody did that, we'd be definitely better off.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, I appreciate those things that providers do. One of the other challenges we have is when editors actually editors writing news, being able to include widgets, and they literally take them from a website, not thinking how to properly include it. So those are the challenge for us also to sandbox that. Yeah.
As something I wanted to add from your comment, I'd really love to ask people to write blog posts and do research and put us to shame. Just to keep the third-party providers in check and say, oh, this is horrible, this is right. So if you see some third-party provider that doesn't provide any synchronous snippet, make a noise about it.
Yeah. I think that's probably an important thing to mention is that you're not necessarily always criticizing them. What you're actually doing is giving them the opportunity to go to their boss and saying, look, at all these people are complaining about it, and that's a really effective mechanism for them to get the resources they need. A lot of these guys are providers. They want to fix the problem, but they've got competing business priorities. If you're out there making a lot of noise about it, it suddenly becomes a business priority, and you really help them to address. We've only got like about 4 minutes left. I'm actually gonna skip one question, which we'll come back to, because I really want to get question number 7 answered, which from Rahul Chowdhury.
Okay, so this is another anonymous question. What could the browser vendors provide to eliminate third-party scripts and the problems associated with them? And I don't really agree with this question.
So I mean, I guess the question that we've got people from the Chrome team, we've got people from Mozilla, we've got people. I'd be very interested to hear from those. But I mean, if you could have one thing from a browser vendor guy to help address this problem, what would it be?
My number one would probably be the script dependencies. Document.write, close second, the ability to group async.
Barbara?
Actually, same. The document write actually.
Like the browsers, they're my favorite.
I could probably go off on this for a long time.
Please do.
So Stoyan set up that basically the way that most sort of complex widgets work today is there's a script that runs on the host page, and it usually opens up an iframe that communicate with each other. And in a perfect world, I would love if Discuss was just an iframe. And there was that separation. Everyone could feel confident about it, and that would be the contract. It's in the iframe. It's not going to escape the iframe. But the problem is that the tools for making that happen are just non-existent. There are tons of, I don't want to say tons, but there are things that are being developed right now for further isolating iframes. There is the sandbox attribute. Let's really break down this iframe. There's no tools that are being developed from the other perspective, which are, let me get access, to some of the stuff that's happening on the parent page. Let me know that somebody's scrolling the page. Let me know that somebody's clicking so that I can close a menu that I have happened to open in my iframe. There's none of those tools right now, and because of that, or even very simply, I cannot resize the iframe today. Because there are none of those tools, we have to have this sort of dual system where we have to put JavaScript on your page, and that's unfortunate. It would be terrific if we started looking at things from the other side, and then maybe things could get better. I think a lot better, just by providing those tools.
Would the web components be an answer to that?
I haven't looked. I've only looked a little bit, perhaps this morning, to research a little bit more about web components, so I didn't look like a complete fool. But from what I've seen is that they're still accessible by the parent page, right? Even if they're kind of hidden. Does anybody know? Is there a web components person? Like you create
the delegate put the hand up thing is not. So if anybody's an expert on web components, anyone?
Yeah. There's somebody over there. Yeah.
Alex. Alex to the rescue.
Hi, yeah, Alex Russell from Google. So the way web components work are, it's a bunch of related specs. We designed it that way for a reason that I won't go into, but you can have something called a shadow DOM, which sort of hides away the implementation of your UI from the normal iteration order through the document. And you're entirely correct that that doesn't solve the problem for you, because you can still reach into the shadow DOM. That it was explicitly designed not to be a security boundary.
Mm-hmm.
Today the answer is put an iframe in your shadow DOM and use it that way. So it doesn't get you out of any of the sizing issues, I'm afraid.
Yeah, so I think a lot of this new stuff, there's the end thing, is still being developed from this perspective of almost like widgets. If I was Google and I had widgets that I want on all my other services and I trust those services, I feel like a lot of it is being designed from that perspective. Somebody can shut me up if they want. Because of like the security things aren't addressed, or there was the seamless spec that came out, but it still let styles come in, as if, maybe for that kind of publisher they may be interested in that, but I'm not interested in that. Anyways, we've got that sheet that says shut up.
That's it. Time to go. All right, so basically we got 1 minute left. We're gonna wrap up. I think immediately after this we're staying here for lunch. Is that right?
Things to say. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much to the people on the party. People on the panel. People on the panel. Peter Potters. I'll hand you back to
Thanks,
Andrew.
Steve.
Thank you.
So we're going to do lunch now. I've just got a couple of announcements before lunch. First of all, everyone's obviously discovered that you can change the name on your Google account to put messages on the screen. That's very clever. Well done. Also, someone sent us a pull request, so thanks very much for that. And if you do have trouble connecting, it seems to be working really well now, but Wesley, who's sitting right here, is really interested to get your feedback and bug reports if you've got a device that it doesn't work on. So go and chat to him over lunch. We've got some smokers who were interested in going outside to smoke. Unfortunately, it is kind of inconvenient. We have to kind of escort you through the building, but there will be people around to do that. So just grab hold of some of the helpers who will take you to where you can do that. Remember to use the feedback form to give us feedback before the end of the day, and lunch is right there, so go help yourselves.